Okay, we are live.
Good afternoon. Welcome to our second summer work session. I'm delighted that you've joined us today. We will move right along because time is of the essence, and we want to make sure that we cover as much of the material for today of pillars 3 and 4 we possibly can. Keep in mind that if we're not able to complete everything today, we'll have a few later work sessions to consider a number of the items that we've not been able to get to today, but we will identify as many of the very important issues as possible, the planning stages for our continued work, and hopefully you'll be able to join us a little bit later on. As indicated in our process, we're clearly interested in having as much participation as possible. We want to be as transparent as possible to ensure that we get all of the voices and all the people who participated thus far to make sure that as we go forward, your concerns and your questions have been thoroughly answered, and we'll be able to proceed accordingly. Today, as I've indicated before, we'll deal with pillars 3 and 4. Our leads for today, the people who will be guiding the discussion, facilitators, Dr. Mara Doss. Stick your head in the window here for a second.
I'm here.
And of course, Fagan Harris will have the last session for us. They will facilitate today's meeting. Let me also recognize Joe Manko. Joe, of any your advisory committee members here today? Want to recognize them?
Yeah, absolutely. We fortunately have 11 advisory committee members who are registered for today's session. So I wanted to just call out their names quickly, and if you are on the call, if you could just come off camera so everybody can see you. But the advisory committee members that we have registered for today's meeting are Jaden Ferris, Linda Gronberg Quinn, Cara Burhans, Ellie Mitchell, Don Martin, Kirk Murray, Candace Dotson Reed, Peter Banyas, Olivia Pearson, Robin Werner, and Ruby Daniels.
Thank you
so much for all of our advisory committees that are joining us today for our session.
Well, you've had 3 of our board members, Joe, Fagan, and Mara. Our vice chair is with us as well. Britt, where are you? Britt Corin? I know Britt is there somewhere.
I'm sorry, Ike, I was on mute. I'm here.
Just introducing you so far.
Yeah.
Any other board here, Rachel?
No, Laura Stapleton will be joining shortly, and Jennifer Lynch was not available today.
But this is a public meeting, and we are in fact live. But let me again reiterate what I started with. We want to be as transparent as possible. We want your maximum participation, but also keep in mind that because we have so many issues to address, it is difficult to deal with all of them today and in our future work sessions. And so there may be a small group here or there that may be asked to facilitate a follow-up meeting beyond the follow-ups that I've just described in terms of the pillars themselves, to just follow up to answering the lingering questions. No decision will be made, and all the things that we'll discuss, we'll bring them back to a later discussion for the entire board and for the public to join and participate in. So you would have an opportunity later on to look at some of the discussions. I would call that more or less as a subcommittee or a follow-up committee to try to respond to any of the questions and concerns that you may have. As we go to today's session, I want to remind you that we are not here to relitigate the blueprint. The blueprint has been approved. We are working, assuming that it is accurate. There may be a request for changes. My position and the position of the board is that we will consider those, but there's a very strong presumption that what we have is correct. Is not to suggest that that presumption cannot be overcome, and that you may not have the opportunity to ensure that if there are changes, we would consider those. But we do not start off immediately saying we're prepared to make changes unless there's a clear evidential basis for doing so. Again, thank you for attending. We will now turn to some of our detailed goals, and hopefully we'll run through those right quick. Want to identify as many of the challenges that we have or questions. We're going to examine the timeline to make sure that the timeline is consistent with our requirements that we have in law. And we have to present an overall comprehensive plan in December. As indicated before, we may have some follow-up small group sessions that will come back before the entire board and before this group to make sure that you have an opportunity to comment on those as well. So with that, let me go to the protocols, and Rachel will run us through that right quick for today.
Sure, Mr. Chair. As we did last week at the first working session, we're asking everyone from the public who is joining. We welcome you and we welcome your participation, but we ask that you keep your microphone muted and your camera off unless you're recognized to speak. And please put any questions or comments, considerations, issues you want to raise in the chat box. And we will be monitoring that and may ask you to turn on your camera and explain your question or your comment. Please try to keep your comments brief so that we can allow everyone, as many people as possible to participate. And if we don't specifically address or discuss your comment or question in the chat box, know that staff is monitoring the chat box and we are taking notes, and we are going to be incorporating items that either are not discussed or require further discussion for the next meeting on Pillar 3, which right now is tentatively scheduled for August 11th, Thursday, August 11th.
Okay, we'll now receive a quick overview of that. So let's get to it. And Emma, I think you're ready to go with that.
I am, thank you. So this should be familiar to anyone who was at our last session. This graphic shows the 5 pillars that are in the blueprint for Maryland's future. And today we are going to be focusing on pillars 3 and pillar 4. So I will just give a quick overview of the content for pillar 3, college and career readiness. So the objectives of pillar 3 include implementing a pre-K through 12 curriculum for students to be college and career ready, or CCR, by the end of 10th grade. You'll see that acronym a lot today. Develop an aligned instructional system with resources and support necessary to keep students on track to be college and career ready. To provide students with resources necessary to achieve reading proficiency by the end of grade 3. To create a statewide framework for rigorous CTE programs and skill standards, and to establish pathways for CCR and non-CCR or non-college and career ready students in grades 11 and 12. All right, so we'll start to dig into this, and I will pass it back over to Rachel.
Thank you, Emma. So Mr. Chair, are we ready to move to the pillar 3 timeline?
Yes, so is there a question from the board or anyone else before we get started? Also, why don't you, looking at the chart of career and college and career readiness, the bold line and the immediate points after that, why don't you just indicate how that is laid out? Because I had a question or two about that before, so that each section is, I think, is boldly indicated, and there individual components beneath each one of those, as I recall, right?
Exactly. So that's a great place to start. So this is the what we call the pillar 3 timeline, pillar 3 being college and career readiness. And the way that this is organized is by objectives, which are in the darkest green, 3.1 there, the darkest color is the objective, the major objective. So there are, I think, 5 major objectives in pillar 3. And so 3.1 is the first major objective. And then below that are the tasks, the major tasks. And then what we've added to the document for this meeting are more details on implementation. with subtasks under the various tasks. And then to the right is the timeline for each item from below the objective. So 3.1, the objective, the overall objective is that students will have equitable opportunities to become college and career ready, and that they will meet the CCR standard at an equal rate, regardless of what school they're attending, what their background is, ethnicity, race, geographic location, language spoken in the home, special needs. And so that is the overall objective, the first objective. The first task then is to assess students no later than 10th grade for meeting the CCR standard. And that is one of the fundamental policies of the blueprint, is to focus on 10th grade as a goal for bringing as many students as possible to that college and career standard by 10th grade, so that they have the remaining 2 years of high school to pursue other pathways. And if they're not college and career ready, they really can focus in on becoming college and career ready by the end of high school. And then to the right of 3.1.1, which again is the task, is a timeline. And you can see there's a star in fiscal 22 and then a line that goes out beyond fiscal 32. The star in fiscal 22 indicates a statutory requirement. So it is part of the blueprint law that students would be assessed no later than 10th grade for meeting the CCR standard. And that began this past school year. So school year 21-22 is the same as fiscal year 22. And that was done by Msde and the LEAs. That is, and then it's an annual requirement, which is why the line is going out, and it's an annual requirement until the statute is changed. Essentially, the timeline goes out to fiscal 32 because that is the last year under the blueprint law of the AIB's existence. After fiscal 32, there's a decision to be made as to whether the AIB needs to continue or it has essentially served its purpose in overseeing implementation, full implementation of the blueprint. So
Okay.
then below that are two subtasks. And we've added these to get into more detail about Pillar 3 and this first task. And so the first item is 3.1.1a, and that subtask is that students will meet the initial CCR standard when they have achieved the equivalent of a 4 or 5 on the math and English portions of the statewide assessments, which are now called MCAP. They were previously called PARC. And this is for the grade 10 assessments. And the initial CCR standard, meaning what we have in place now, and we have had in place for a number of years now, using the PARC or MCAP equivalent of a 4 or 5 on math and English. And the yellow dots there to the right of that indicate that the statute didn't specify a date for when this would begin, but the commission, the Kerwin Commission, and the legislation made assumptions about when things would take place. And so yellow dots are estimates or estimated dates based on the Kerwin Commission or the legislative history. And so you can see for fiscal 22 and 23, there are yellow dots, meaning that that is the standard that's currently being used. The next subtask is 3.1.1b.
Before you go on,
Yeah.
explain that a little bit further. So that the dot in 24 means what?
So for 3.1.1a, there are dots in fiscal 22 and 23, meaning that for now, this initial CCR standard that is specified in the law is what is being used. It was used last year and it will be used for this upcoming school year. There actually are also some multiple measures of readiness that the state has been using through an MOU between the school systems and the community colleges for a number of years that is still in effect. The
No, what-
next,
What would be the time for the change?
that would be fiscal 24. So I was going to, so the next line is where the yellow dot is in fiscal 24 is referring to the updated CCR standard. And that updated CCR standard is based on the empirical study that is required to be done of the skills and knowledge that are needed to be successful in entry-level college credit courses at community colleges and also post-secondary training. And so once that study is complete, the updated CCR standard is to be based on that study's results. We will not, the study is required to be completed by September of 2023, which is in fiscal year 24. And so that is why the yellow dot is in fiscal year 24.
All right, Amara, do you have any questions or issues up to this point of where we are? Are there any concerns about what we've looked at so far from you?
No, not from me. It's pretty clear cut, and we are in sort of a holding pattern, so to speak, until fiscal year 24, when we're actually possibly looking at the new standard for CCR. I'm checking the chat to see if we have any questions on this particular section. And also, any board members, do you have any questions or anything that you'd like to add? Okay, I don't see anything right now in the chat, which means that we can go on. No, I think I do. Hold on. We just got one from Brad Phillips. I'm sorry. And Brad is asking, when we do have an empirical study for fiscal year 24, are we to apply the results in 24 or 25? That's a good question. And I'm actually going to see if, do we have anyone from MSDE here? We do?
We do. And Ari Amerikaner, the Chief of Staff at State Department of Education may want to speak on this or refer to someone. I will just say that the empirical study will be completed in September of 23. The state board typically adopts the college and career standard in the spring for the upcoming year. And so I think the likelihood is that the new standard, the earliest that the new standard would be used would be the 24-25 school year or fiscal year 25.
Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Brad, for your question. We have another question. This is from Darrell Hornick Becker of Bard Early Colleges. And the question is, in addition to the results of a study in fiscal year 24, will there be opportunity for stakeholder engagement to inform the updating of a CCR standard? And stakeholder engagement is always, always important. And what we're doing here today is part of that stakeholder engagement. But specifically, I am going to ask if Ari could speak a little bit about that. Any specifics to what is planned for that for MSDE?
Good afternoon. Hi, everybody. Yes, thank you for having us. Thanks for doing this. We are, as Rachel said, on track in our study work the study is expected to be completed by September, I believe it is, of next year. So we'll be on, in line with the statutory deadline. And then I can't tell you what our specific plans are, but I can tell you that absolutely everything that we do at MSD, we are really committed to stakeholder engagement and community input. So and any action that would be taken would be with the State Board of Education, which is similarly committed to public input and stakeholder engagement. So I cannot fathom that we would not want to really focus on that component of the conversation as we get a little closer to it, for sure.
Thank you. And I know when we spoke early on, we were talking about the study, and I wanted to stress again the importance of one specific entity, which is, of course, the community college being able to be engaged as we go through and looking at the new CCR standard. Thank you, Ari. We have another question. Oh, this is specifically for Rachel. This is from Genevieve Floyd. And it says, will something in writing be shared with the LEAs to confirm the MAC and PSSAM? I never know how to pronounce that acronym. I know what it is, but I never know how to pronounce the acronym. CCR agreed upon assessments measures will remain in place for this coming school year.
So that is a good question. I believe that the LEAs and the community colleges have already agreed to continue the multiple measures for the coming school year. But I do see that Mary Pat Fannin, the executive director of PZAM, is what we call it, is able to respond to that question. Mary Pat.
Sure. Good afternoon. We are going to be meeting with the community colleges as we do every year in September to sign the MOU. And so to specifically answer the question, the MOU usually, sits with the superintendents as well as the community college leadership. But anyone is welcome to it. We can post it on our website. I don't expect any major changes from last year's MOU.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Rachel, does that help you? Does that response?
Yeah, I think that answers it. I was just off on the timing. I thought they'd already done it, but it sounds like they're going to be doing it soon. Before we go on to the
in the chat there.
I was gonna, before we go to Adele's question,
Okay.
I wonder if I could go on to the next task, which is the study, just to cover that, and then the questions might make more sense.
That sounds good.
So 3.1.2 is the empirical study that MSD is required to contract for to study what is needed for students to be successful in entry-level courses and post-secondary training at Maryland community colleges. And you can see the STAR is in fiscal 23, and MSD was required by law by July 1 of 2022, so just a few weeks ago, was required to undertake this contract. And then the contract itself, as part of that, the selected contractor must examine top performing education systems around the world and compare them to Maryland. And also, as part of this larger study, not just of the community college success requirements, to consider potential sources of bias in whatever assessment the contractor may propose to assess whether a student meets the CCR standard, and then to submit the completed study and their recommendations around what the CCR standard should be and how it should be assessed. And so you can see for the first two items, there are yellow dots in fiscal 23 and 24, which essentially, again, those dates aren't specifically in the law, but based on the required start date and the required end date, it sort of can easily back into when the study will be done. So there are yellow dots in fiscal 23 and 24, and then the star in fiscal 24, which reflects the September 1, 2023 due date for that study. And so the
Okay.
study is two-part. It's and actually in some ways three-part in the way that the RFP has been written. So there's the empirical study that's required by the law to look at what students need to know and be able to do to be successful in entry-level credit-bearing courses and post-secondary training. Then they've also included a predictive analysis as part of the study. And then the third element of this study or report is that the vendor would make recommendations on how the CCR standard should be assessed. And if they propose to use a particular assessment, to look at whether there's any bias in that assessment and how to eliminate it.
Hey, Rachel.
Yes.
So I forget which will be done first, the empirical study or the other study?
I believe the timeline, I think the predictive analysis will be done prior to the empirical study, because I think the empirical study is a more will take more time. But I would also defer to Arian or someone else at Msde to speak to that.
We have both of the studies. The study as a whole, I believe, is all due September of next year.
Yeah.
So in terms of timeline, you know, we may exceed that. If we can't exceed that, we will. And Mr. Crowan, I believe it's possible you're also thinking of the sort of interim study that we are doing. But correct me if I'm wrong. But that component is purely a quantitative look and predictive analysis, and that sort of early analysis will be done sooner, but that is not the sort of official study. That is all on track to be completed by September of next year.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the board members before we return to the chat? Hey, as I'm looking in the chat, I'm seeing sort of a little theme here beginning to form concerning the study. And we have another question from Addie, I believe, that talks about or asking when stakeholders can hear more detailed information about the study. And so again, stakeholder engagement is always important in everything that we do around the blueprint. And I'm asking Aria, I'm going to ask you to come back on again because this is important. And I know at least I have not seen anything that, you know, walks step by step or specifically talks about when and how that input or engagement is going to take place. Is that something that we can consider and maybe take a look at and craft together as far as how we're going to make sure that we do have this stakeholder engagement?
I think it is safe to say that, yes, absolutely. We want to be working hand in glove with the AIB on all of the implementation of the blueprint, but certainly on the CCR component in particular. And I know that you have such deep expertise and connections in the field and in the work, Dr. Doss. So certainly we want to be working collaboratively.
And
absolutely.
Right, right. And so I think at some point, and maybe we can actually look at specifying how we're going to make sure that we have that engagement from other stakeholders as we go through this study. Okay.
That sounds great. And
Go
I'll
ahead.
drop a link in the chat. Just in the interest of transparency, if anyone's interested in it, the technical components of it, I'll drop a link in the chat for the RFP itself as it exists, so that anyone who wants to look at it is certainly welcome to. It's public, so I'll do that in just a second.
Great, great. Thank you.
Is there anything proprietary in that though?
Not the version that is public, no. It's just that is out for the world.
Okay.
We won't. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question. Mike Woolley, can you unmute for us and ask your question? Mike, are you there? Okay, Mike Woolley had a question, and I'm not sure, I'm going to ask it, but I'm not exactly sure what this means. Will assessments for CCR that are not standardized MC tests be considered?
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. There you are.
I was having a little trouble getting unmuted. Yeah, I was, other than like the, the park or something, and Tim Guy put a link in to the document. I looked through it, and I think Tim answered the question. There are other assessments, skill assessments, and other sort of practical hands-on kinds of things, and that's what I was hoping to hear. So yeah, MC is multiple choice. I was just wondering if we're going to use more than just standardized multiple choice tests, because we know that some students do well on those, and others don't demonstrate their knowledge and skills through that. So I'll unmute now. Thank you.
Okay, gotcha. Excellent question. And Guy, I do see further down that you put that in the chat. Appreciate it. We are all working together. Love it. All right. Shalom.
Dr. Doss, Mr. Manco has his hand up.
Oh, I couldn't see that. Yes.
Hey, Dr. Dodd. This may be less of a question, but just I guess kind of my meandering thoughts, because I've been thinking about this a lot around the College and Career Readiness Standard. I think this is, a huge task for, what we were trying to do overall with the blueprint. Identifying what the appropriate measure is, and I think there's been a lot of conversation. I think really echoing what Mike and what Tim have already surfaced just around, what the role of multiple measures are in determining the College and Career Readiness Standard, what the role of some kind of objective assessment is versus what the role of, either some kind of performance assessment or, what the role of the general academic criteria that students engage in, whether it be grade point average or how they're performing in certain classes as evaluated by their instructors. So I think this is it is a question that really needs a lot of thought and rigorous debate, because there are clearly differing views on this that I think are all very valid. So, just wanted to kind of put that out in the public sphere, because I think this is a really important question. And, I think the extent to which we rely on student performance as evaluated by grades or performance as evaluated by some kind of objective measure, whether it be a standardized test or a performance assessment, trying to figure out what the right criteria is for determining whether students are prepared. I think it's going to be really critical for the public as a whole.
No, it is. Thank you. And it is It is so important because, again, and we've said it before, that the CCR and getting students career and college ready is the North Star, so to speak, of the blueprint. It's that endpoint. That's what everybody's working for and working towards, and making sure that we get it right, of course, is of utmost importance. And we have our formal studies that we just talked about. That's going to help us get there. The studies that are already ingrained in the blueprint and so forth. And then we all know, and because we're all embedded in it, and we all know what happened with the pandemic and how it changed some of the things that some of the practices that we thought were best practices, and specifically related to the CCR, it gave us an opportunity, I'm going to say it's an opportunity, to move away from some standard assessments because we didn't have access to them in the way that we needed to. And it gave us an opportunity to try out some other things, or some other, I shouldn't say things, but some other practices. And so now we have this full-blown conversation around what is best. How much weight does this take? What is the what multiple measures, what direction, and so forth? And that's what we're all working toward. And I'm glad that you kind of just put that out there, Joe, just to say, hey, this is it, and this is what we are all working toward and trying to figure out as we move along. Shalimar has a question. Broken pathways. The cracks in career and technical education in Baltimore City public. Oh, okay. She's responding to that source of information. Thank you, Shalimar. And then there's Tim. And okay, I think we're good. Everybody is sharing data. Already put in the chat the request for proposals. And Brad Phillips said that my colleges all have outcomes data on multiple measures and happy to provide if needed. And thanks, Brad. The AIB, we would love to have that information shared. So I appreciate that. Any other questions or comments on 3.1.2? Anything else, board members? Okay, and we'll move on. And if anything ever comes up as we're moving on, don't hesitate to just put it in the chat. And again, I'm trying, and we are trying to get to every question. But if we don't, the questions in the chat will be addressed. All right, Rachel.
Thank you. So the next task is 3.1.3, and this is the State Department of Education develops a fully aligned instructional system, including high quality curriculum frameworks and instructional materials with regular updates. So that you can see to the right, based on the timing of when the law passed, fiscal 22 was the first potential year for that Msde to begin doing that work. And so the yellow dot is there, and it's clearly an ongoing work. And then you can see the subtask of 3.1.3a is that once there is an updated college and career standard, whatever that ends up being, that the instructional system and materials would be revised to align with the updated CCR standard. And this provision is one that the commission talked a lot about, that high performing systems tend to have well curated instructional materials that are high quality, that are aligned with the frameworks, that are then aligned with the curriculum, that are then aligned with the standards, and that teachers, highly effective teachers work with others across systems to develop those materials and share them, so that there is a good sort of supply of materials that are vetted, for lack of a better word, so that every teacher isn't sort of trying to reinvent the wheel every time. And particularly the alignment is really important. And I see a question.
I have a question. And I just wanted to note before we go to the questions that even though we have, you see the bullet points and we've taken it out and broken it down into tasks, there is no way, it's kind of unmeasurable to actually measure the work or the amount of work that goes into each of these from everyone who is involved. And the next question just kind of hits on that. It says, this is from Joe. Joe, you're supposed to raise your hand. You're throwing me off here. Okay. It says, since traditionally curricular decisions have been under the purview of the LEAs, can you explain how the curricular frameworks will be established in a way that preserves the curricular autonomy of each district? Excellent. And I'm going to actually throw that one back to Rachel for a minute.
Oh, well, I'm going to throw it to Ari. So.
Oh, okay. She did come on. I didn't want to keep it. I see you. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I think stepping back for a second, this is a long-term project, as is evidenced in the long yellow arrow that Rachel and Emma have put onto our screen. So I think the big picture answer is we are just getting going on this work at Msde because we need to, frankly, not get ahead of the adoption of the standards, because the whole sort of point, right, is for all of this to be aligned. So we just talked quite a bit about where we are in terms of the study, the Ccr study that will be done in a year. And from that, we will adopt final standards. And so we don't want to be making decisions or forward motion around the things that are to be aligned to those standards until we have those standards. So I just wanted to sort of frame that out in terms of where we are in this part of the conversation. To the question Mr. Menko posed around the curriculum and the frameworks and the relationship with the LEAs, we certainly will follow all of the requirements on the law about this. And I just, for some historical context here, and Dr. Collins, if you want to add anything, you should feel free to, but for some historical context, there are frameworks that we have, that the state Msde has always, with the state board, the frameworks that Msde has put out for curriculum have always been frameworks, tools for districts to use as they develop their curriculum and adopt curriculum. And the frameworks the curriculum needs to be aligned to those frameworks, but they're not a dictation of any sort of curricular decisions. And so hopefully that helps in sort of understanding the difference between the words and the concepts.
Could I ask a follow-up question? I believe in as much local autonomy as possible, and it's always good to try to work toward that goal. But if we're trying to get a empirical analysis and study of the performance of our students around the state, how do we do that unless we are at least starting from some level of a common framework? So those two things are somewhat potentially now in conflict. And so we don't have to answer that now, but that's the question that would come to the back of my mind, that if you're in one part of the state and you allowed for a greater level of autonomy, they're doing something totally different from another portion. And we're trying to get an assessment as to our overall performance. How do we do that if we have a larger level of local autonomy, which many of us want and support?
I think that is a great long-term conversation and a tension that we will continually have to live in that tension area. But I will say that I do think it's important to think about the distinction between the standards and the assessments, which we are statewide, and then the how do we get there, the tools and the instructional opportunities that districts provide and educational experiences that districts provide to their students to get them there. and that, you know, I think it is possible to have statewide standards and statewide expectations and statewide assessments and still have flexibility in the how. But of course, with guidelines and high quality instructional frameworks that are
Okay.
provided by.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Kerwin has his hand raised. You're on mute, Dr. Kerwin.
It's on the same topic because I have the same a similar concern that I just expressed. I mean, I think one of the factors in the high performing school systems that we looked at is the schools had a single curriculum that was everybody was teaching to that curriculum, and it kind of goes against the local autonomy that is in the DNA of American education. So I'd be curious to know how closely at present do the districts follow the curricular framework that's set by MSDE? Do the districts follow it pretty closely, or is there some pretty wide variation? Does my question make sense?
Your question does make sense. I have a thoughtful answer to give you at this moment, to be honest. So let me say that we will investigate a bit and or invite anyone from the district side to jump in if they wanted to add any perspective. Because
if the districts more or less follow the MSDE guidelines, then I think the issue becomes less of a concern. I also think, and Rachel, you should answer this, that if a school district is found to be underperforming, or a school is, aren't they at some point required to use the MSDE framework?
That is part of the blueprint. That is part of the blueprint that, and also part of the expert review team process. So if an expert review team finds that a school is underperforming, and that after working with them and providing technical assistance and doing all sorts of things to help that school improve, but they're not doing all the things that they should be doing, then yes, they are required to specifically follow the state's curriculum framework.
Good, thank you.
Absolutely.
And was there anyone in here from the district who may have wanted to just weigh in on Dr. Kerwin's question? Anyone here? Okay, while we're
I'll see if I can
Mary
get you an
Pat?
answer.
Mary
Yes,
Pat,
sorry.
okay.
I'll see if I can get you some information on that, Dr. Kerwin,
Thank you.
and the rest of the group.
Cool beans, thank you. Jamoria, I'm going to ask you to come off mute, and you have a question in the chat, and to just actually ask your question.
Hi, Dr. Doss and members of the AIB. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to do this. So my question is in follow-up to Joe Manco's question. I'm wondering whether the AIB thinks that this requirement related to curriculum development is going to create room in the Maryland General Assembly for them to pass legislation and take a more active role in addressing public education curriculum. And regardless of whether you think that it's, if you think it's possible, do you have any concerns?
I'm just going to say, just in general, I don't know if even if it did get to that point, how it would impact the blueprint. So your question is valid. Your question is good. So when you asked it, it just made me think, okay, if it did get to that point, how would it impact the blueprint? And I'm going to actually ask one of our board members or Rachel to kind of respond to your question.
Well, I'm happy to go first. So sort of following up on your point, Dr. Doss, I don't think that this provision in the blueprint creates room for that. I would say the room is already there. And having worked for the General Assembly for 28 years, I know that at least over time, there's been a sensitivity in the legislature to respect the state board's role in setting, specifically setting curriculum. However, that does not prevent members can introduce legislation on anything, and committees can certainly consider them. So there's always the possibility that the General Assembly will pass legislation that is very specific on curriculum, but in general, that is the state board's role, and in general, the legislature has, respected that boundary, but there's a tension there for sure.
Thank you for that perspective, Rachel. Anyone else want to weigh in on that? All right. We have another question. This is from Chuan Chang. It says, from the equity perspective, how does Msde balance the high quality curriculum frameworks and access for all students? And Ari, I'm going to ask you to come back on again. We know that equity is at the forefront of everything that we do. And could you respond to this particular question?
Well, certainly. And hello, Dr. Chang. I don't think it's a hard thing to balance. I think that ensuring that every student in Maryland has access to high quality curriculum, high quality instructional materials, high quality educational opportunities is in fact is what equity means, and access for all students to high quality is about both excellence and equity, and we are striving for both and every day, and certainly we'll continue to do that. Whether everyone gets that is a whole different question, and something that we are diving into with every tool at our disposal, right, to try to make sure that we actually provide the supports necessary and meet the needs of every individual student. But certainly that's the goal, and a high quality curriculum can take different shapes across the state of Maryland, but the standards, again, are statewide. The what every kid is supposed to learn is the same across the board for the state in terms of the standards, and the frameworks are aligned to those standards. It's the curriculum, the how, that might be different across different systems. I hope that's helpful and responsive.
And another question that's very similar is from Carolina Reyes. And do you think that having district autonomy may cause a problem in equity? So we have the equity thing. I wonder why in our community, I see families moving to counties where they think public schools are better.
I don't know if this is directed at me, but I'm happy to say certainly we are deeply committed and worried about, and hi, Carolina, we are deeply focused on and ensuring that every kid in every community and every school has a great opportunity to get a great education. And absolutely, I think just stepping back into like the big picture world of education policy and education practice, because this question is such a great one that's so big picture. From my personal perspective, yes, there is sometimes a tension between sort of local control and sort of differences with ensuring that everyone has a great opportunity. But also on the other side of that, there are real reasons for local control. There are real differences in community needs and community assets and community strengths. And so it is a balance. And this is why we try to really lean into both ensuring that the standards and the what everyone is offered have a minimum high level of excellence and sort of standardization across the board, but also that we leave room for customization, personalization, and sort of making sense within a local community. And that is a hard balance, but we are deeply committed at MSD to that equity angle, to making sure that it's good across the board.
And if I could just add, I mean, that's exactly what the blueprint is designed to do. It sort of is balancing the local autonomy with the, high level expectations and the same expectations across every district and every part of every district, because it's not just between school systems, but actually within school systems and within counties, there can be very, very different quality of school opportunities. So the blueprint really is designed to set the requirements that every school system is required to provide for every student, and then provide some flexibility around how they do that. But the what they have to do is much more specified in the blueprint than ever before in terms of educational policy. And that's exactly to be equitable.
The balancing act, and I like the way that you said, Rachel, local autonomy and expectations. Because with the blueprint lens, within and among the counties, the equity question comes up. And you've always said, Rachel, that within the blueprint, interwoven, every part of it, every sector of it has a lens of equity.
Yeah.
I was looking at equity. So well said.
Thank you.
See, we're still on. This is from Shane Tate. And her question is, what accountability measures are being considered to support the expectations of equitable implementation and accessible, high quality CCR curriculum experiences across LEAs, alongside the focus on development of the standards and appropriate assessments? Okay, that's a lot.
That is a lot, and it's a really important question. And it's exactly what this process, and as we continue through this process, essentially the next level, once we have identified sort of the level of implementation detail that we need to identify, it's then to determine what indicators or measures of progress or accountability are going to be used to determine whether that task or subtask or objective or going up another level, the goals, whether they're being achieved, and whether what is needed to be done to achieve them is actually being done. So it's an excellent question. I don't have a specific answer right now, but it's absolutely the right question to be asking.
And I think as we go more into some of the objectives and the task, it does hit on that a little bit, talking about the assessment. And we have, let's see, oops. That was Shane. I want to make sure I get at least one more question in here before we move on. Robin Werner, for CTE, districts must identify achievement gaps within subpopulations for Perkins funding. We develop plans of action for our funding, specifically targeting improving achievement for these groups of students. Would this be a practice that may be considered in the blueprint? And do we know if blueprint will impact Perkins 5 or be aligned to it? Okay.
Well, I can definitely speak to part of this, which is absolutely, and part of the law specifies that AIB will look at disaggregated data among subpopulations of students across a wide measure of different, not just achievement gaps, but other gaps, opportunity gaps and other gaps. And so that definitely will be part of what the AIB will be looking at to measure blueprint implementation. We do have CTE is later on our list. Although I don't know that how much time we will have for that. We've got about an hour and 10 minutes or so left now. So I don't know if you want to ask someone from the Governor's Workforce Development Board to speak about Perkins 5 now, or put a pin in that one.
So what we may do, I'd like to just continue on with 3.1 if we can, and then we may circle back around to CTE with the Governor's Workforce Board, and then that may help address Robin's question as well. And Robin, I do know from working with Perkins 5 that, of course, there are very, very specific categories that are talked about in Perkins when we're addressing different groups of students. And so that's a good question. I'm hoping that maybe our CTE group, our Governor's Board, can shed some light on that. So what I would like to do now is to actually go and move to 3.1.4 so that we can finish up, and then 3.1.5 so that we can finish that up, and then we'll move and change direction a little bit and go into CTE discussion. That's the one thing about Pillar 3, that there's a lot in it, and there's the CCR and the pathways, and then on the other side we have the CTE, and both of those are really, really huge topics. So, okay, Rachel.
Sure, yes, they are huge topics, which is why we already anticipated we would need more time, and we will, whatever we don't cover today, we will pick up at the next meeting on August 11th. So 3.1.4 is really focused on how students are assessed as to whether they meet the updated CCR standard. So once the study is done and whatever the new standard, updated standard is going to be, we need to then, the state board is required to, in the law, adopt cut scores on assessments that would indicate college and career ready. And then you can see the dot for that. Again, there's not a specific date in the law, but based on the timing of when the study will be complete and the updated standard would be adopted, the yellow dot is in fiscal 24, which would, depending on the amount of changes to the standard, would be the earliest that that the cut score on a new assessment. If it is a new assessment, it would probably take longer, but if it were an existing assessment and adjusting the cut score, then fiscal 24 would be the earliest date that can be done. And then you can see the subtasks below that that specify some of the things that the State Board of Education in the law, again, is required to determine whether the current assessments are sufficient to identify whether students meet the standard, and if they contain a potential bias, and of course eliminating that bias. And then if they're not sufficient, to adjust the assessment or use a new assessment, or and again, to many people's point, but Mr. Manco earlier, the law speaks specifically to assessments and does not speak to multiple measures, but that is a conversation that has begun and is ongoing as to whether that will need to be modified at some point. And then there's some specifics about only requiring students to, oh, I'm sorry, the next one is, this was something that was put in the law, that if it is a brand new assessment, a brand new standardized assessment, that it has to be field tested and piloted for at least one school year before it is required in order to be determined to be college and career ready. And that the cut scores would reflect the study results. And so all of those things are in fiscal 24 in the timeline. And if I could just maybe cover the next one real quick while we're here. 3.1.5 is the broader task of a communication strategy to sort of inform and educate parents, students, teachers, the public about the CCR standard, why it's important, what it is, and what it unlocks for students who are college and career ready, and how important it is that we focus on that. And as you said, the North Star of the blueprint, Dr. Doss.
Mm.
And so that there's a star in fiscal 23 because that date is in the statute that Msde would begin developing the communication strategy. And obviously,
that one indication, Dr. Moss, if you don't mind, this is where we'll have the greatest impact of pushback and explanation about the potential unintended consequences, potentially a bias. And so we need to have that locked down as best as possible when you go out to the general public, because that's the question that many parents and others will be asking. And this is the point for which you get the most reaction, if you will, to whatever the standards are at the time when you are basically explaining that to the general public and to the parents.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And again, there's this theme this afternoon where we're talking about equity and engagement and that stakeholder engagement and the parents and students and so forth are our most important stakeholders. And I just wonder if Ari, and I know that you, MSDE, may not have developed this yet or gotten to that point, but can you just remark on thoughts or where MSD is?
Absolutely. We are, so we did want to both meet the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. And so we, recognizing that the law said that we needed to start, I think it said start a communication strategy in January of 2022. So we did, that was one of the reasons that we published that report that someone put into the chat a little bit ago earlier this year, and which is a sort of an outline of the CCR, the college and career readiness component of the blueprint, and also the work that has been done to date and the options that we will be considering going forward as we think about a standard. Because, while we often think of a Twitter campaign, we also think communication with the public is about really laying out in some detail different sort of what the charge is from the blueprint, and also the work that has been done to date and the plans that we have going forward to implement it. So we started with that report, and then we have done social media and other things to try to advance the awareness of that report. But of course, we also don't want to go too far on a communication strategy before we've actually made some decisions about what the standard. So we want to both keep people informed and engaged, and we are doing, as I think many of you know, strategic planning engagement now, and so we've done a lot of engagement. We've done a lot of listening sessions, a lot of input, getting a lot of input from folks around a lot of similar topics, and so we're continuing to do that kind of engagement, and we will certainly keep doing that. And I think this is one where once we get some decisions made, we can do more intentional communication.
Thanks, Ari. And Shalimar, could you come off mute and ask your question about CCR assessments?
Yes, my question, and I don't know if it's a fully developed question, let me just say that. I am asking how is a CCR assessment different? Is it a little bit different, somewhat different, whole new ball of wax than these other tests that students have been taking over the years? So be it the bridge test that we took, the subject test that we took, or the test that came, I can't remember the name of it, but when we started doing Common Core, there was a test, I can't think of the name of it right now, slips me. And so those tests, which we thought were tests that told us that students were ready to graduate. I know that doesn't mean that they said that they were college and career ready, but it did say if they can pass these assessments, then they are applicable for graduation. So my question is, how is a CCR assessment different than those? And when we implement those CCR assessments, will they be there, or will that be something as an educator that I'll say, how long are we going to do this before they say, we're not taking this test anymore? Because, and as students as well, and my comment says it affects us emotionally, socially, academically, because we never know what's coming up, and we can never trust that this is enough. So I think the question that I would prefer to know is, how is this assessment different than these previous assessments that we've taken?
And Shalimar, I'm gonna let Ari expand upon this, but thank you for your question. It's so very important. And the one thing that you said was college and career ready. And that's where a lot of the difference comes in this time. But I'm going to let, of course, Ari go ahead and explain a little bit more.
Thanks, Lamar. It's always so good to see you. And that is that is an excellent question, right at the heart of everything. So I think the answer is we don't know yet how different it will be. It's quite possible it won't be that different. I think you were trying to think of Park as one of the assessments, the last round that came in at the same time as sort of the Common Core work, and now has evolved to MCAP, as Rachel mentioned. We are trying to, in the course of this study, among other things, one of the things that we are trying to assess is which kinds of data points best predict students' readiness for success in college and career, right? And so one of the things we are studying, or we are asking an expert to study, is how well these standardized test scores that are already in the field right now, MCAP, for example, predict that college and career readiness. We are also asking how well a student's GPA in high school predicts readiness and success in college and career. We are asking to look at a variety of potential predictors so that we can pick something or some set of somethings that are a good measure of college and career readiness. And so I don't know how satisfying an answer that is, but that is the truth is we might come back and be told these things are actually quite good predictors in Maryland of success, and you don't need a lot of change. Or we might get told they're quite bad, or some version of them is good, or they're good for some students, but not others. And so that's the question that we are asking right now.
Could I interrupt you 1 second? Obviously, if we said we had that answer already, it would no longer for us to be here today. So as you've indicated, we really don't know for sure. And it may be some time before we actually know. Even if we come to an agreement about what that assessment should be, as you've just indicated, we may find that there may be some things better down the line. There may be some changes that need to be made. And so the real answer to that is that we don't know today, and it will be some time before we still have a full answer, even if we've adopted something, because we can't put that in concrete to say in perpetuity that we have an assessment that we can agree upon that meets all of the requirements that we're seeking for all the students throughout our entire system. It will be constantly tested, constantly monitored, and potentially adjusted as we go forward. But there may be pushback, there may be challenges, but that should not deter us from coming up with what we think once we've had a full assessment of it, whether or not that particular model is what we ultimately want to use going forward.
Dr. Kerwin?
Yes, thank you. It's a great question that was asked. But, and I don't know if this is helpful, but I would say that what the CCR test that is part of the blueprint is tied to a very specific goal, namely that if a student passes this test, they are ready to take credit-bearing courses, either career courses or college courses at a community college. In the past, I don't think the tests that were being used were tied to such a specific goal, and that's what led to their change. There was no, it was not really related to anything as specific and concrete as the CCR now is now. I think the fact that we're tying it to the ability to be successful in a college credit-bearing course makes gives a very rigorous basis for the CCR, and I think will be easier to measure. And so I personally think, there may be changes in the tests in the future, but I think it will be much less so, and but always with this very specific goal in mind, unlike the current environment.
But Dr. Kern, you would agree that we don't know the answer to that until we've had a chance to look at that assessment, right?
Exactly. Once we know, we have to get an assessment that predicts success in a college bearing course. That's what this assessment will. That's what this assessment will be. We don't know what that assessment is yet, but once it's determined, it has that very specific goal, and if it's a good predictor of that, it's unlikely to change.
And the second part of the question is, what would there be a difference between this test or some of the previous tests? Well, we don't know that either, but I do know whatever we've been doing thus far in the previous tests have not provided us with that closed indicator of the North Star. So probably something different, but how different may be, we can't say that at this point in time. But I can say that whatever we've done in the past have not worked to the satisfaction of our students in meeting their career readiness potential. So how much different it may be, I'm not sure yet, but it probably will be somewhat different, but you can't answer that question until we've had the assessment made.
Right.
So overall, I'm hearing that with the blueprint that we have a maybe not so much in the past, but now we have a comprehensive, focused, researched, monitored, assessed will be effort to predict the CCR standard. But of course, we don't know yet, but we do know that we are moving forward in a better manner than what we have been.
Not provide the kind of bias that people have complained about in the past as well.
Right.
And so that actually relates to Shamoya's question. And she says 3.1.4C of the legislation doesn't seem to include the presence of bias, racial, economic, or otherwise, as a consideration of whether the assessment should be used as a gate to keep students out of these new CCR opportunities. Does the AIB interpret? I'm so sorry, I lost your question.
Do you want me to?
I found it. Does the AIB interpret the presence of any bias in the forthcoming CCR assessment as disqualifying for its use as a gate to the next level of coursework opportunities?
You say any bias?
Any bias in the forthcoming CCR assessment
Let me
Yes.
start off in the following. I would love to have an assessment that is so clear, so empirical, that eliminates any bias whatsoever. That's a goal that we should all strive for. But to say that there would not be any bias, that we cannot reassess this, I cannot give that guarantee, because we may look at this down the line and find something that was not intended that retains some bias. We should be constantly monitoring that, trying to make sure that we adjust to it. But if we've got a standard that we start off that in some way can say it does not contain any bias, I would love to have that, but that's a pretty difficult standard to meet. We will say that we will try to eliminate it and try to adjust to it as we go forward, but that's a pretty difficult standard.
Mhm, mhm. Okay, eliminate, adjust, and it'll be, of course, in the forefront of whatever we do. Rachel, do we have time to actually go? I would like to just get some of the CTE in. Do we have time? Because we do have a point, and I just want to say it. It's not necessarily a question, but it's a good segue. And it's from Kevin Wajek, and apologies if I'm not saying that last name correctly. What a student needs to be able to do, know, in order to take a college course and a technical course may not be the same. Hopefully, the assessment will account for that access to technical pathway opportunities. And that's, I think, is a really good segue into some of the CTE discussion.
Absolutely. And let me just, there's also a question from Genevieve Floyd below that about the definition of CCR and whether it could be expanded to include success in the workforce, specifically via CTE certifications and not limited to success in a college-bearing course.
Oh, she's
So
so
that's a
awesome.
really, so those two questions together are a great segue. And
Mm.
let me answer that question first. The CCR standard is intended to be the minimum knowledge and skills required to be successful in a credit-bearing college course or post-secondary training course. So both the college and career aspect of readiness are incorporated into the one standard. So recognizing that there could be a higher standard depending on what college pathway you might be pursuing and what subject area. STEM, obviously requires different sort of minimum skills and knowledge. But the goal of the 10th grade CCR standard is to come up with what is the minimum that it can be successful in entry level college level courses and post-secondary training courses. So hopefully that helps answer your question, Genevieve. And before we move to CTE, or as we're moving to CTE, Ari noted that Perkins funding is currently administered by Msde, and under the blueprint, it becomes sort of a shared, shall we say, function. Msde is still administratively administering the Perkins funding. But under the blueprint, the Career and Technical Education Committee takes on a role of helping to determine how those funds are being allocated and used. So, but Ari, did you want to say something about the Perkins 5 question?
No, well, I can. I was actually just going to add to your prior answer about the CTE. I'm sorry, the question about what kids need to be college and career ready might be different in a career program, and just wanted to flag that in the RFP that we put out, what we're going to be asking people to the evaluation to include, it explicitly calls out credit in and or successful completion of a post-secondary training program, sort of separate from. So the college courses, or in addition to the college courses. And yes, we are continuing to work toward making sure that Perkins is strategic and high quality and implemented in alignment with the blueprint. And we are happy to keep doing that, and obviously want to work with the CTE committee on that work.
Great. Okay, so then do we want to go to, I think it's 3.5, Emma? 3.4, that's good. Great, so 3.4 is specifically expanding career counseling and career and technical education offerings and participation around the state. The first item task is 3.4.1, and this is a new career counseling program provided to middle and high school students that was included in the blueprint. And there is specific funding that is provided in the formula, the foundation formula, to support this new career counseling program, so that students start to think, in middle school about what their potential ambitions are and interests, and what the path is for them to start to move toward achieving that. And you can see in fiscal 24, there is a star. That is when the funding for the career counseling program begins, and then it is ongoing. So the line with the arrow. And then in 3.4.1 A and B, this is a requirement that the LEAs enter into an agreement with their local workforce development boards, as well as their community college, their local community college, and if appropriate or applicable, an American Job Center, which are job centers that are federally funded and run by the Maryland Department of Labor, and that the local workforce development boards will report on the use of funds and their impact on providing career counseling. So essentially what the blueprint calls for is a 3-year pilot where the local workforce development boards, again, in agreement and in collaboration with the school system and community college and potentially job center, would actually develop and deliver the career counseling for the middle and high school students. And you can see there's a star in fiscal 24, and then a line and a star in fiscal 26. So it's essentially a 3-year pilot to see whether how effective providing career counseling, engaging the workforce folks that are going to be ultimately hiring the students in the career counseling, and not just having it sort of sit in the school system. And then there's a final report that's due to the AIB on what I'm calling this pilot program in fiscal 26. And right now, at least at that point, it would be up to each LEA, local workforce development board, community college, it would be up to their local group to determine how they want to move forward beyond the required time when the local workforce development board would be implementing the career counseling program. And the CTE committee, is a new entity that is created by the blueprint and is located within the Maryland Department of Labor and under the Governor's Workforce Development Board. And the commission specifically did that, and the legislature adopted it to bring the CTE work beyond just the K-12 system and incorporate the employers and trade unions and others who are the community colleges who provide lots of this type of training around the state. So sort of to bring it beyond just the K-12 system in terms of facilitating the coordination of the CTE pathways. And that is ultimately what we're talking about, is creating more rigorous and many more pathways, CTE pathways for students who can begin that pathway in high school once they're college and career ready, hopefully by the end of 10th grade. And to that end, 3.4.2 is a task, but it's also a goal enshrined in law, which is that 45% of high school students would earn an industry recognized credential or complete the high school level of a registered apprenticeship by the year fiscal 2031. So specifically, it's by December 2030, which is in fiscal 31. So that is a very, very high goal. I believe the last time I looked at this data, it was under 10%. And so one of the big tasks of the CTE committee is to establish annual goals to get to this 45% goal by fiscal 2031, and then to monitor progress toward that goal. The CTE committee in 3.4.3 is also required, just like there are expert review teams for the K-12 system, there are also expert review teams to look at the implementation of CTE programs. And the CTE committee is required to submit an annual report on the deployment of those teams, and to be looking at the success of the new, more rigorous CTE programs. The STAR is in fiscal 23 there. That would be this year, that would be now. However, the CTE committee is not fully established yet. It is, I believe they're waiting on one last appointment. And so because the CTE committee does not fully exist yet, they're not able to submit any reports or do any of this work yet. So the AIB did receive a letter from the Governor's Workforce Development Board, which will be the staff to the CTE committee, just expressing that, they're not able to submit the report at this time, and that they will begin this work next year. And so we put a yellow dot in fiscal 24 just to indicate that even though it was required for fiscal 23, based on the timing of the CTE committee's establishment, that provision won't begin until fiscal 24.
Hey, Rachel, real quickly, could you remind us of the appointment process for this group?
It is a joint appointment by the governor, the speaker, and the president, I believe. And Mike DiGiacomo is the executive director of the Governor's Workforce Development Board. So Mike, if you have anything to add, please.
I do. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Molly Mesnard, and she can kind of go through where we are, how the board was established, and where we are with that. Molly, do you want to move forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Molly Mesnard, Director of the Governor's Workforce Development Board. So just to give a real quick update, since a couple of questions were about the CTE committee members. So basically, we've gotten some members appointed over the last few months, and I'll give sort of a list of those members. And as you all know, in the blueprint, just to answer Dr. Kerwin's question. Basically, there's 11 required members of the CT committee who also have to be appointed to the Governor's Workforce Development Board. And the members, as they're listed in the blueprint, are the State Superintendent, Secretary of Higher Education, Secretary of Labor, Secretary of Commerce, the Chair of the CTE Skills Standards Advisory Committee, and that individual was just recently appointed. That is Judy Emmel, who is recently retired from a long and distinguished career at the NSA, overseeing their state and local affairs, and including their workforce development programming. And then there are 6 members who are jointly selected by the Governor, Senate President, and Speaker of the House. And these members have to collectively represent employers, industry associations, unions, community colleges, agriculture, and experts in CT programming. So of the 6, 5 have been appointed. They are Brian Cavey from the Insulators and Allied Workers Union, Matt Holloway from Quantico Creek Sod Farms, Sharnetta Young from CVS Health, Myra Norton from Arena Analytics, and Michael Thomas from Baltimore City Community College. So we are just awaiting one more appointment, and hopefully that will happen in the near future. And then just to kind of continue the update is that the CT committee itself was officially received funding fiscal year 23. So we really started to, actually get funding just July 1st. And so from that, we've been starting to post for staffing positions and hire staff to support the many duties as are listed here of the CT committee. So we look forward to kind of getting everything up and running. Over the last year, Mike and I from the Governor's Workforce Development Board have been, meeting with Msde, CT directors, partners across the state, local workforce development boards, and so forth, just to sort of get an idea of the CTE in Maryland and kind of lay the groundwork so we could really get up and running starting this year.
Thank you very much. That's really, really helpful, Molly.
Absolutely.
Molly and Mike, I'm so glad that you are here because we have some questions in the chat that maybe you can help us out with. And I just wanted to just remark on one comment that when Rachel was going through and we were talking, she was referencing 3.4.2 with the 45% of high school students earning industry recognized credentials or completing high school level of a registered apprenticeship. And we all know that based on our current, where we are currently, the 45% is like really, really high, or we think that's high. But just looking at how, if we do this and we do it right, how the blueprint brings in career counseling, emphasizes career counseling, emphasizes the local workforce development board and the community college. And not that these players weren't in it or aren't in it now, but what the blueprint does is it makes it more cohesive and it seems to streamline how the students are actually in contact, or how these entities are actually interacting with the students, so that the students have a clear plan and they have an idea, a better idea of what's out there, a realistic idea of what's out there in industry. And then the workforce development boards or the local workforce, because they are informing the high schools and the community colleges and so forth on what's needed, that it brings everything into alignment in order to bring that percentage up. And I know that that's what it's all intended to do, but I just thought I had to say that. Okay, so we have Dave Harper from Chesapeake, and he's asking, is it accurate to say the CTE will recommend funding structure that will support expansion in dual enrollment to allow for implementation of more CTE programs? And if so, in what fiscal year will that funding land? And having more CTE programs be eligible or participate in dual enrollment is very critical to making all of this work. So Molly or Mike, do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I would just say with the CTE committee not being officially established, we obviously can't say at this point what the specific funding structures and so forth are going to be. But as Dr. Doss pointed out, dual enrollment is certainly something that is, encouraged throughout the blueprint. So we're definitely going to figure out ways to, align everything. And I don't know if anyone from MSDE also wants to speak up, because we will be working very closely and have been working very closely, with our partners at MSDE, since this is a close collaboration between CTE and what's actually going on in the school systems.
I don't know if anyone from MSDE will want to speak on this. They're certainly welcome. What I can tell you is that there is a funding structure in the blueprint to support dual enrollment in community colleges and four-year institutions. We've had this mechanism in place actually for several years, but the blueprint streamlines it a bit and specifically incorporates post-secondary training. They're not really called CTE programs at the community college level, but the post-secondary training programs are eligible for students to enroll under the dual enrollment provisions. So the funding mechanism is in the law, that the school systems would pay 75% of the tuition, the cost of the program, and at no cost to the student or their family. And the school systems are receiving funding through a new funding formula that is tied to the number of students who are college and career ready in 11th and 12th grade. So they are receiving per pupil funding to support the cost of dual enrollment and other costs associated with the post CCR pathways.
Thank you, Rachel. We have another question, and this is concerning equitable outcomes for students in counseling. This is from Shamoria. Will there be evaluation of or metrics set for the implementation of the career counseling program to ensure equitable outcomes for students? Maryland's guidance counselor workforce was 64% white in 2020, which tracks closely with teacher and other educator demographics in the state, even as Maryland public schools serve more students of color than white students.
I'll take a shot at that. I mean, basically the local workforce boards are working with employers and job applicants and students every day. And they are measuring all the time the measurements for federal registry, federal as well as state, to make sure that we are providing equitable access for everybody.
And I would just piggyback on that, Mike, to say that I think the CTE committee and AIB, as part of the comprehensive implementation plan, and then the CTE committee's implementation plan, will definitely be incorporating, again, indicators of progress or metrics that will look at both the outcomes and equitable outcomes, so disaggregated, of career counseling programs.
And Dr. Collins, did you want to say something?
Yeah, just really quickly, I won't take time, but I just wanted to add, hi, I'm Dr. Deanne Collins, Deputy Superintendent, MSDE. Just wanted to mention that it's great that Mr. Chaudhary, State Superintendent, does have a seat on the CTE committee. So MSDE will definitely be heavily involved. And we also meet with Mike and Molly regularly. So we're kind of all on the same page and talking. So the lines of communication are always open. And so these questions that are coming up through this meeting not only will be discussed through the CTE committee, but also the meetings that we have with the Governor's Workforce Development Board, as well as Mike and Molly. So just wanted to say that.
No, appreciate that. And Mr. Mako, did you have something, question?
I had two questions. The first is on 3.4.1, just around the career counseling, and I think this is maybe directed more towards Rachel, just around the funding that is attached to this, so that there are, it's the intent to have more counselors within high schools and middle schools across the state? And if so, is there a prescribed ratio in terms of, you know, how many counselors there should be for every so many students? I would say is one question. And then the second question is maybe directed more towards Mike and Molly around the apprenticeships, because it seems like a concern around the apprenticeships is that this is heavily reliant upon industry partners, and you know, just what you feel like needs to be done in order to concede that ground with the business community and get them invested. And you know, really at a 45% clip, that, you know, if an apprenticeship is really designed to be a one-on-one experience between a student and an industry provider, you know, how many folks within the business community we really need to get bought into this and committed to this in order to make those, you know, that goal a reality.
Rachel, do you want to answer the first part first, and I can go on to the second part?
Sure. So the funding for career counseling, I would have to go back and refresh my memory specifically, but there is a ratio of students to career counselor that was incorporated into the cost estimate for providing career counseling for every middle and high school student, which was then converted to a per student amount. So I need to go back and double check what the ratio that was used, but it was based on a certain amount or a certain ratio of student to counselor. The concept of this, what I'm calling this pilot program, is really to determine whether, and it might be different by LEA, whether the right model is having that counselor in the high school or middle school versus a different setup, such as at a local community center or job center. So that might vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And then Mike, if you want to speak, and then I also see Senator Rosapep's hand up, and I know what he's going to say, but I will let him say it.
Senator Rosapep, did you want to go first, and I'll piggyback on what you said on your comments?
No, you go, Mike.
You know, apprenticeships are an important part, and we're working we need to find ways to expand apprenticeships across the multiple sectors. We need to work with businesses to reduce the barriers. We know there are barriers with employers, and we are going to work with the CTE committee to find out what those barriers are and find ways to reduce those barriers so that we can get more students engaged in the conversation around apprenticeships. And so as we start to build the CTE committee, we will be working with our employers to find ways to get more folks engaged in that conversation.
I would just add to that, big picture, we have enormous workforce skill shortages in the state. I meet with employers all the time. They're desperate in healthcare. They're desperate in IT. They're desperate in manufacturing. They're desperate in logistics. They're desperate in trucking. There are so many unfilled jobs that the demand is there. That is not the problem. The problem is the school systems have not been oriented to giving the employers access to the kids. About 20% of high school students right now have paid jobs, but they are not through apprenticeships with career paths. They go out and find a job on their own. Most of them are in hospitality and in childcare, both of which need apprenticeships as well. There's one high school in my district, it's the most Latino high school in the state, High Point High School. 25% of the kids there have a job they found on their own. Another 2/3 of the kids want a job if they could find one. The system needs to be fixed. And that's what this whole thing is about, is flipping the system so that CTE is the classroom training for the registered apprenticeships in high school. So the employer hires the kid at age 16, 17, they're working, they're paid, that's the motivation for the kid. They're producing for the employer, that's the motivation for the employer, but it's part of a structured career path through a registered apprenticeship that takes the kid from unskilled, low-level pay within a few years to a skill level and a permanent job. They do it in other countries. That's what this model is based on. They do it in the UK, they do it in Australia. We can do it in Maryland.
Thank you, Senator Roosevelt. It's good to see and hear from you.
Thank you, thank you. Thanks.
So I have a question, and Senator Roosevelt kind of just brought it to the forefront for me when we're talking about flipping the system and changing and so forth. And we have MSDE, who CTE, Perkins, and so forth is currently under MSDE. And then we have the CTE committee coming on the scene with the blueprint. And while we have representatives from MSDE and our CTE committee, and however you guys want to take this or address it, can you share with us how you envision how this is going to change with the CTE committee? And when I say this, as far as the CTE and so forth being under MSDE.
I'll take the first shot at that. And basically it's to get employer involvement, right? We need to really get employers engaged in the conversation to understand what skills are required for the jobs that they have and make sure that they align with the skills that our students are getting in the classroom on the way out the door, so that there's actually an alignment that when they come out through an apprenticeship, that they actually are able to get a job with the skills that the employers need. That's what we are going to be collaborating with MSDE through the CTE committee, with our community college and our local workforce boards, is to make sure that the skills that they're getting in the classroom align with the skills that the employers need.
Could I add to that?
Sure.
Just as a participant in the CTE work group with the Kirwan Commission, I'm very familiar with why the commission recommended creating the CTE board committee. And the reason was they wanted to flip the structure. Historically, CTE has been driven by schools and employers have been on the sidelines, which is what Mr. Manco raised, and it's clearly the issue. It was a very strong view of the Kirwan Commission that the employer community needed to be in charge, that MSD should work with them and support them and help execute, but the approval of the programs and the strategy and the funding and the evaluation would be done by the employer-driven group, the CTE committee.
Okay, thank you. And MSDE, does anyone want to comment or have anything to add or share from the MSDE standpoint? Harry, thank you.
Hi there. I will just add that we are continued, as Dr. Collins said. I'm just reiterating really what Dr. Collins said a few moments ago, that we are very eager to work with the CTE committee. As I think many of you know, this is a passion point for Superintendent Chaudhary, that getting this right and making sure that these are high quality pathways for students from the student perspective, as well as meeting the needs of the employers. I think he thinks of it in both of those directions and would say that this is critical work. We are under state law, the sort of implementer of the Perkins money, but I think we are absolutely interested in working with the CTE committee on getting all this right. And as Dr. Collins said, the CTE committee, the superintendent is on it. And so we're really looking forward to doing that work and to ensuring that we're advancing the blueprint's goals and priorities.
Okay, all right. Appreciate your responses. I know that that's a question in the room. And I have another question that just flows right with that. This is from Robin Werner. CTE programs are usually state adopted programs with technical assessments that are connected to state national industry exams. CNA certifications, Maryland cosmetology license, etc. Does this mean that MSDE will be revising our programs, or will LEAs be doing this independently?
I'm going to say that that's really for up to the CTE committee. That's where the CTE committee will set the standards on what's going to be required, what certificates and is going to be required, and what skills are going to be required to get those certificates. And that's what we'll be relying on the CTE committee and many of the business folks on our board to be able to help determine that both across all the industry sectors.
I could add one little point to that. Given that the goal is to have the CT programs all as integrated related instruction of registered apprenticeships, the high school level of registered apprenticeship is the goal. Those standards will also have to be approved by the Apprenticeship and Training Council. For a registered apprenticeship, it has to be approved by the Apprenticeship and Training Council. And they've done it for 100 years. They evaluate the skill standards in registered apprenticeships. So I think it'll be the CT committee and the Apprenticeship and Training Council that will set those standards going forward.
Together, as you see it now, collaboratively. Okay.
Mara, I got to raise a question. I'm very impressed with the things that are required between the CTE committee and the school system itself at the local level. I think within an appropriate period of time, we can establish the appropriate standards and align the coursework with the business requirement for workforce. The biggest challenge that I have is how do you commence the program and the students' interest and the parent interest in the first place? Because one of the things that would immediately transpire would be some people may look at this as a traditional tracking program with a different name. And so the 3.41, where it requires the career counseling program provide to middle and high school students, I think is crucial to work with the students, the parents, so that which is I think the intent of the blueprint, was provide this as a very good program that we find literally all over the world, for which there are meaningful jobs and participation at all levels in school. And so that piece, we cannot overlook that, because if not, we could have the best program going on paper, but people not interested in not pursuing it because we have not provided the appropriate pathway, the counseling, and the marketing of this in such a way that will provide us with the outcome that we're seeking. That is so crucial here. 3.41 and other programs designed to, in fact, properly counsel people, including the parents, and also explain it in such a way to the community so that we get the best ultimate result and provide the support that many of these students may want and need.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you. And the counseling part, again, is so critical, and counselors can be gatekeepers at times. And I'm just going to say that too, steering students into different careers and into different pathways. And so that training and so forth is so very critical. And the other part that you mentioned about the communication and the marketing with the parents, and there are two questions in the chat, one from Thornell Jones and then the other one from Carolina Reyes, about low-income families do not know anything about the 21st century jobs that already need many more new employees than are available. How will students learn about these opportunities? And then Carolina goes on to say that I think we also need to positively promote these programs. For instance, the Child Development Program in high school is a great way to start early childhood educators. And I know that the CTE committee is, just getting their footing and so forth. But how do you envision marketing addressing these 2 points?
I'll take the first shot at that because we've had a lot of conversations about that over the last year. And I always say words matter, right? We have to determine that it's not, it's not an or, it's an and, right? When you're going through a curriculum development and you're going to get a job and you're going to get an education. You might do one before the other, and we might change the timing of what one does, but it's not I'm going to go get a job or I'm going to go to college or a community college. We need all to be, consistent in messaging that it's an and, so that it's just basically, am I going to go get a job before I go get an education? Am I going to get an education when I get a job? We can do all that. So I am totally on board with in managing, working with the CTE committee and MSDE in a broader message of what we're really trying to accomplish and what the blueprint really has, is that it's not an either or, it's an and. And I think we all have to kind of get into that messaging when we're talking to folks, because right now, even businesses think, well, apprenticeship's not for me, that's for the trade people. And students think, well, yeah, I'm either, if I go into the trade, I can't go to community college. We need to change the conversation. And, that happens both at the school system as well as within the CTE committee, but even on a broader perspective, as we're out talking to chambers and we're out talking to our local workforce boards and we're out talking to folks, we need to communicate that it's an and not an or. So I'll just add that's kind of one of the things that we've talked a lot about, and we need to find out ways to actually make that come to action.
Well said, well said. And that's one of the reasons why we wanted to not necessarily go in the order of the timeline objectives for this, and to actually kind of flip over to CTE, and so that we are discussing this as not an or, but and together. Rachel, how are we on time?
We got about 10 minutes, all right?
Yep.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
About 10 minutes for this section.
Okay, all right. Want to make sure. So we have another question from, this is from Genevieve Floyd from Montgomery County Public Schools. As someone who oversees CTE programs within the school district, I am still unclear of the relationship with LEAs, MSDE, and the CTE committee, and I'm in need of clarity. Am I correct that the LEAs will continue to work with the MSDE staff, for example, on Perkins, student organizations, data reports, etc., and the MSDE staff will work with the CTE committee? If not, how are LEAs working with MSDE and the CTE committee, or is that structure to be determined? So this is where I'd like to call in almost everyone and kind of let MSDE start this off if possible.
So one of the things that Mike and Molly and I have already talked about is there are existing relationships that MSDE has had that will need to continue, but the CTE committee will be an integral part. The Perkins 5 grant will still be run and facilitated through MSDE, but there will be opportunities for the CTE committee to weigh in and provide input, and also work with LEAs as well. One of the goals we want to make sure that we're doing is streamlining some of the plans that the LEAs submit, so that it aligns to the intent of the blueprint, and continue to provide that on the ground assistance to the LEAs. So that definitely won't be changed. But I've kind of envisioned like a my job, your job, our job, as we roll all of this out together. But each entity plays an integral part, and we just have to make sure that we're aligning and not stepping on toes, and that the messaging is really clear. So I think as the CTE committee gets up and running, we'll know more and be able to coordinate more and really flesh out and communicate sort of the your job, my job, our job, and what the collective work will look like. But overall, most of this work happens at the LEA level, right? So we need to make sure that the LEAs remain an integral part to this work. that we're doing and help, as we talked about the importance of communication, getting the messaging out. I mean, that's going to be really critical that we don't leave our LEAs out as we move forward. Mike, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Sure. So yeah, thank you. So all I would add is we have been very intentional over the last year to introduce every CTE director at the local level to each of the local workforce board directors. Many of them are actually already on their boards, but to start that conversation about how that's going to look and what that might look like. We envision that most of that work is going to be done at the local level. The CTE will provide guidance, the implementation, because the different businesses, there's different business structures in each of the different local areas to actually work together. We have to talk to the CTE committee and work with them on where everybody else fits in. Where does people like the intermediaries, where does ABC and construction, where does MEP and manufacturing, where do all those people fit into the conversation? Because those are the folks that we're going to look to for some of these standards, and so we are going to drive them. We've talked to them as well to drive that at the local level to kind of coordinate with our partners at Msde, as well as the local workforce boards, the community colleges, and form small communities at the local levels to be able to find out how we're going to, then roll that up to the CTE committee. So we are actively working on it at the local level.
All right, thank you. We have another question from Shamoria, and it is the CTE committee prioritizing aligning CTE offerings with other blueprint priorities, CTE programs for teachers, educators, therapists, early learning providers, etc. So this is specifically for the CTE committee. Any thoughts on that?
When we have the committee, we will definitely prioritize as we put together we're starting to put together the actual implementation plan, and we will prioritize all of that within the plan.
Could I jump in on this one as well?
Sure.
So public service apprenticeships are a big thrust of state policy. This current state budget requires the Department of Health, the Department of Transportation, and the Department of Public Safety by the end of this year to develop a registered apprenticeship pathways to deal with their workforce shortages. It also requires the University System of Maryland and the Community College Association to work together to figure out how they can redesign their teacher education and their nursing education programs to make them the related instruction of registered apprenticeships. So the focus specifically on education and on turning the traditional programs into related instruction in apprenticeship program is already underway.
And I would just make one other comment to one of the other questions that came up about what are we doing to give kids exploration opportunities? We are working with folks like Junior Achievement who are in the school at the middle school to work at the 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade level to determine what it is that they might want to do. We are working with virtual reality platforms to be able to give them the opportunity from a diversity standpoint that they might not be able to get out and see what a hospital looks like, what a manufacturing facility looks like. But if you've ever seen any of the virtual reality technologies and platforms, we believe that there's an opportunity working with Msde, working with our local workforce boards to get, and people like Junior Achievement, to get into our classrooms at the 5th, 6th, 7th grade. So by the time they actually get into high school, they actually have an idea of what curriculum that they might be interested in. So just more ideas that we've worked with through over the last year with Msde, with the local workforce development boards, and with some of these vendors to be able to kind of move some of this forward.
Thank you. And I think we have time for this one last question.
Yes.
Okay, and this is directed specifically again to the CTE committee. Will the CTE committee have representation from different areas in Maryland, such as the Eastern Shore?
It does.
And I'm sorry, it was the Eastern and Western Shore. And although we adopt the same program, CTE looks different across the state due to careers and industries available in our districts. I'm sorry, that was the whole question.
So I'm going to work it backwards. So there's 6 people on the committee. we were, and I think that everybody was cognizant of making sure that everybody, as many people as could get engaged as possible. We do have somebody from the shore that is on the CTE committee representing pretty much the agricultural world. But regardless of who's on the committee, as we start rolling into the local areas, we know that they are going, that's why we need to get involved with our other partners that are in the local areas to roll up into the CT committee what might be specific to a specific area. And that's Matt Holloway. So Matt Holloway is our agricultural representative on the CTE committee.
Okay, thank you. And we do have a statement from Strong Schools Maryland that says that Strong Schools Maryland is prepared to work with the CTE committee and what they find external engagement or external stakeholder engagement helpful as it completes the important work that we are doing. Okay.
Good. Any other questions you have, Mara?
I don't have any other questions. I just want to make one remark that coming out of the discussion with the themes, we have equity, stakeholder engagement, and getting this right. Seem to bubble up is very important to this group and to this discussion that we had today. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mara. Let me thank everyone for participating. There may be some additional questions or comments. You can send them to the staff. We're prepared to accept those. There may be some additional issues that we have to work on, and we will try to do that and report back to you as we move forward. Again, thank you very much, Mara, for your leadership today. We will now take a 15-minute break. It is now 3:16, so that means it's 3:31. We'll come back and we'll go to Fagan on our next pillar. Okay, thank you very much. 15-minute break. Rachel?
Yes, Mr. Chair. Are you ready?
Yeah, but my video, for some reason, they've disconnected here. We ready?
We are. We have all the board members back.
Okay. The host has asked you to start your video, which I did. I don't know what happened. Okay. All right, here we go.
Oh, there you go.
I think we're ready now to start our second session, the next pillar 4. We have as our facilitator for this, board member Fagan Harris, who will lead us in our discussion this afternoon. Why don't we go just do a couple of quick reminders, Rachel, so that people are aware of the process that we're going to follow, so that we ensure that there's no unintended consequences in terms of people facilitating some challenges that we have to deal with technologically and otherwise.
Absolutely. So welcome back for Pillar 4. As we have been doing in the previous sessions, we're asked that everyone mute themselves and turn off your camera, and please put all of your questions and comments and concerns in the chat box as you've been doing, and potentially Fagan or I will ask you to come off mute and explain your question or comment. Please try to be concise so that we can allow for as many people to participate as possible. And if we don't get to a question or comment, we are absolutely taking notes on everything in the chat and everything that's being said, and we will incorporate anything that either wasn't discussed or needs further discussion in the documents for the next working session, which for Pillar 5 tentatively will be on Pillar 4, excuse me, will be on August 11th.
Okay. All right. I think I'm ready to give a brief overview.
I am, thank you. So we, as you all know, if you were here for the first part of the session, covered Pillar 3 in college and career readiness in Part 1. And Part 2 will be focused on more resources to ensure that all students are successful, or Pillar 4. So I'll just quickly run through the objectives for Pillar 4. One is to, first and foremost, provide more support for students in schools who need it most, specifically additional supports for English learners, students receiving special education services, and students from low-income backgrounds. To provide new concentration of poverty grants directly to eligible schools to support community schools and enhance wraparound services. And finally, to coordinate community supports to meet student behavioral health needs and provide technical assistance to school systems. So now I will pass it back over to Rachel.
Great, thank you, Emma.
And please just again the chart that we have, in case someone else may not be able to follow it as well.
Absolutely.
Yep, I am bringing that up right now.
Okay. So this chart should be starting to look familiar. And so what we, this is for Pillar 4, and the high level first item is what we're calling the objective, which is 4.1 in this case. And so the first objective under Pillar 4 is 4.1, which is developing a proxy for identifying students who need more resources to be successful. This is a major task that the commission started working on and made some progress on, but I think certainly everyone would agree did not necessarily resolve the issues around how we count low-income students for eligibility as a proxy for students who need more resources to be successful. And this is separate from English learners and special education students who have separate funding formulas. This proxy is specifically, this count is used for the what we call the compensatory education funding formula, and also the new concentration of poverty schools formula. And so 4.1.1 is the first subtask under that objective. And it is to include Medicaid data in the direct certification income eligibility data that is used currently as a proxy for this count, which is tied to eligibility for free and reduced price meals. Free and reduced price meals is reduced price meals are set at 185% of the federal poverty level, and eligibility for free meals is at 130% of the federal poverty level. And so what this provision is doing is incorporating, typically families need to fill out a form in order for their students to receive, to be considered eligible and receive the free or reduced price meal. This can be a barrier in many schools, just you know, to simply the process of having families fill out the forms and return them can be a challenge all the time. And then there are additional challenges in some schools in getting families to return those forms, particularly if they are have concerns about residency, citizenship. And so one recommendation the commission made is to incorporate Medicaid data, which is currently, particularly for the Children's Health Insurance Program, is an income eligibility where their income is verified and they are determined to be eligible for what we call MCHIP. And there is a level of MCHIP eligibility that is very close to 185% of poverty. And so that was one way to broaden the count and try to capture more students in the count that we use now. One of the counts that we use for this new formula. And I don't know if Msde or anyone from Department of Health wants to speak on this point, but the law does require the Maryland Department of Health and Msde to request participation in the federal government had to approve this. And we've seen some documentation that it was recently approved, effective July 1 of 2022. So this year, this fiscal year 23. And so that is why the yellow dot is there. And then there's the line going out indicating that, you know, the Medicaid data would be included ongoing. I'm actually, the approval that we receive from the federal government may be time limited. I'm not actually sure about that. So there perhaps should not be an arrow all the way out. But if Msde, anyone wants to say anything about that. And then the subtask 4.1.1a relates to a reporting requirement that has already been met by Msde in terms of last year in fiscal 22 around this. And
yeah, Rachel, I don't know if there's much more. I just, because you invited, I'm happy to say essentially yes to everything you said. I'll drop a link in the chat to the larger report that we submitted, which to the General Assembly last year to meet this requirement. It is broader than just to focus on updates on Medicaid data, but kind of covers this whole 4.1 task. So I'll let you go through that before I drop it in the chat.
Great, thank you. So I think what I'll do, if it's all right, Mr. Harris, I'll go through all of these 4.1 tasks and subtasks, and then you can open it up
Absolutely.
for
Thank you.
comments and questions. So because they're all very interrelated, because it's all about this count. So so that was one aspect of how to make the count more accurate. Another way that is part of the blueprint is that MSDE would develop an alternative form. And this would be a form that would just be a state form. It would not be a federal, it would not affect federal meal eligibility, but it would be a state form that families would be asked to fill out specifically for our state count for compensatory education and concentration and poverty grant. So essentially we would sort of break off from using free and reduced price meals as our indicator, and we would try to, or we would keep that, but then, you know, use like a greater of kind of thing. If you collect these alternative forms and the count is higher, then we would use that higher count. And this one thing that this would do is it doesn't affect eligibility for public benefits, federal public benefits that can affect future citizenship. So that was another alternative to get a more accurate count. Under the blueprint, MSD is supposed to develop this alternative form in the coming year, fiscal 23 that we're in now. And they did submit an interim report on this topic as well. I think the alternative form is not now that we're in this, still in the pandemic phase. I think the alternative form may not be as helpful as perhaps it might have been prior to the pandemic, because school systems are having a very hard time getting families to fill out these forms now. Families have been able to, you know, receive free meals during the pandemic as part of the federal COVID relief funding, and without filling out forms. And so the count was down significantly in this past school year for reduced price meals because families did not fill out the form. And so just getting families who used to fill out the form to fill out the form is a challenge now, let alone families that have been reluctant all along. So I'm not sure how much this alternative form is going to address or provide more data. And that leads to 4.1.3, which is the commission talked a lot about this, worked with consultants on this, and you know, they got as far as they got, but they were not able to look at all options that might be viable. And so they asked MSDE, the commission recommended the blueprint, has MSDE looking at neighborhood indicators of poverty and whether and how to use those neighborhood indicators of poverty as ways of counting students eligible for who need these services and provide the schools with this funding. And and specifically in 4.1.3a to look at the American Community Survey data from the census to see if school district poverty estimates and also this area deprivation index could be used. And as those of you who may follow this know that Mr. Chaudhary is very, this is work he's done in Texas, and he's very involved in this, and MSD has been doing a lot of work on this. They submitted an interim report in the last year, and they will submit a final report on by November 1st of this year. So that's why the star is in the fiscal 23 column for all of 4.1.3. And then in 4.1.4, one provision that was added to the law is that MSDE begin to collect the necessary data to implement whatever they recommend should be done in their November report, so that if the decision is to move forward with that the data would be available pretty quickly to be able to start incorporating that into the count. And Ari and others at MSDE may have more to add on this.
Fagan, I think you have some questions here.
Great. I want to bubble up Shamoya's comment about the alt form can also address college application and press test fee waivers, and how that dovetails with the CCR equity priority. I think that's such a critical and important point. We can't achieve equity if we can't get the resources to the students who need them most, and getting these counts right is one of our better tools for doing that. I've got a global question here from Buzzy Hedelman to start us. Will the AIB consider the question of sufficient resources for effective implementation of the blueprint? And is the AIB informed on numerous concerns by many community groups about inadequate funding of the base and weights? Mr. Chair, I might hand that one to you, given that's kind of a bigger picture question here.
The last part was about a weight. I didn't understand a piece of it. The last piece was,
is the AIB informed about the inadequate funding of base and weight? I think he's referring to the formulas.
I can take that part if you'd like.
go ahead.
So, okay, so let me, so the blueprint specifically requires the AIB in its annual report to the Governor and General Assembly to evaluate or assess whether there are sufficient resources to implement the blueprint as intended. And so that is certainly something that will be happening. How that is done is part of what these sessions and the additional work in the fall we'll need to develop and inform. And that piece of it really sits under Pillar 5 as part of how blueprint implementation will be evaluated, and what, if any, recommendations the AIB may make if there's a concern that the resources are not sufficient. And so as things move on, if there is a concern that the AIB feels is legitimate, and after analyzing it, around inadequate funding, which could include the base and the weights, as Buzzy is referring to, which is essentially the base is the foundation formula. That's the major formula that funds the bulk of education funding for students. And it is essentially, it's the funds that are needed for all students. And then the weights refers to funding that are needed, additional funding that is needed for different subpopulations. And so that would include this proxy that we're talking about here in 4.1, using free and reduced price meal or low income student counts for compensatory education. English learners has its own additional funding for those students, and special education, of course, there's additional funding formula for special education students. And now we've also added the concentration of poverty school grant to kind of layer on top of compensatory education. And there are also other new blueprint formulas that are in addition to the foundation, for example, to fund college and career readiness, post-college and career readiness pathways. So that's sort of a very, very quick Cliff Notes version of the funding formulas under the blueprint. And so hopefully that's helpful.
It's super helpful. Go ahead, Mr. Chair.
That's an argument that we will have for a considerable period of time. Because as we adjust, as we change and we monitor, and as the economic conditions around us play out, it is quite possible that a very serious argument can be made in the future as well as now whether or not the funding is in fact adequate. So we can never close the door on that. But I do not want to open it up prematurely. But the question is an excellent one. Did we get it right to start with? And will we have it right going forward? I think that's a question that we're going to have to constantly monitor and constantly try to seek some answers to. We're now looking at, the new General Assembly coming in January. We're looking at obviously a new governor and all of the other things that go with that. So that argument, whether or not we have gotten it right and the formulas are appropriate at this point in time, will be an ongoing debate, but it's certainly a legitimate question that we will have to constantly monitor and answer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and Buzzy, thank you for the question. I'm going to go to my friend Ellie Mitchell from the Most Networks, and her question is, how do neighborhood indicators of poverty interact with school districts that have high levels of school choice, such as Baltimore or PG, where many students attend middle and high schools far from home? Rachel, and maybe our friends at Msde can weigh in on this.
Yeah, I'm going to ask MSDE to comment on this because I think it's an important question, and it's part of the challenge of using census data and neighborhood data to drive school funding formulas.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, happy to do it. So this is a great question and an important one, and I think actually, and one we have a relatively easy answer to, which is that every student would have a need score based on their neighborhood. So it is, no matter where you go to school, you bring your neighborhood indicator of poverty. Just like no matter where you go to school, you bring your under the current system, you bring whether you're eligible for free and reduced price lunch as a student to that school, regardless of how close that school is to your home. Similar here, right? You bring your neighborhood with you, so to speak. You bring your neighborhood indicator of poverty based on your address. So you match student addresses to the school at which they attend. And then you, just like with free and reduced price lunch data that we're all used to, you average that, across the school to get an estimate of the school's student body need. So I hope that is helpful as an answer.
So helpful. Thank you so much. Ellie, I hope that answers the question. Mr. Joe Manco, you're up.
So I had the exact same question as Ellie. So
okay.
Yeah, thanks, Ellie, for asking it ahead of time.
Terrific. Okay. Any other questions on 4.1 before we move on to 4.2? Okay, thank you all. Let's move on to 4.2.
Can I just ask, Charlemar says that the chart view is cut off. Is that still a problem, or is that resolved?
Rachel, it's resolved. Thank you.
Oh, great. Okay, thank you. Okay. So 4.2 deals with the, actually specifically with English learner education. And the blueprint, this was something that was added to the blueprint by the legislature. And so as part of the commission's work and part of the adequacy study, the commission recommended additional resources for English learners, students, but it did not make any specific recommendations around the educational services that should be provided or should be bought for the funds. And so this work group was established to look at this very specific issue, and MSDE is both staffing it, and the superintendent is chairing this work group. And they submitted an interim report last year in fiscal 22, and that is why you see the stars in the fiscal 22 column. And the final report is due in December of this current year, so in fiscal 23. And I believe they have another meeting next week. I don't know if anyone from area or someone else from MSD would like to provide an update.
Sure, Rachel, I
Yes,
can do
I think
that. Oh, sorry, Ari. Yep, this is Dr. Collins again. Yeah, so this has been really exciting. The EL work group, as you mentioned, is chaired by Mr. Treasury. and has been meeting since last August. The way the meetings are structured is it starts with a national spotlight. So you bring in like national perspectives, and then usually a panel discussion with practitioners around Maryland in the field. We've had a parent panel, we've had a staff panel. We try to include a data dive, and then a discussion and use of an activity to do a discussion. I won't tell you all the topics that we've talked about, but we've talked about the status of English learners in Maryland, multilingual learners, dual language education, bilingual education. How do you support multilingual families to navigate the educational system, improving services, funding, et cetera. And so it's been exciting work. It's really been good to hear. We have advocates, people in the field, community members that are part of the work group. And so it's been great. And all of the meeting notes, the agendas, the meetings are on the Blueprint website, on MSD's Blueprint website under English learners. So those can all be accessed there. And we do have another meeting coming up next week, public meeting. It's on Thursday from 3 to 5 o'clock.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Collins. All right. Rachel, do we want to go through these piece by piece or jump right into questions?
I think you can go ahead and jump into questions on the work group.
Terrific. So the first question is from Shamoya. Does the English language learner report require cost estimates for the recommendations they'll make? It'd be helpful as we assess the adequacy of funding for ELL over time. And it ties into Buzzy's question overall about the sufficiency of funds. It's a great question. Rachel, what's your sense of this?
I certainly think if the recommendations, so I think the initial purpose was to look at the best practices for providing English learner services to students and their families. The funding that was provided through the Blueprint was based on the adequacy study, and then it was enhanced to provide, and Dr. Collins mentioned working with families to provide specifically provide family coordinators for I think it's every 10 students, but I don't hold me to that. I would want to double check that, that there would be a family coordinator available in a school. And so I guess the question would be, if depending on what the recommendations are, if there's a feeling that they're going beyond what's already
In the
there.
law.
Yeah.
Ari or Dr. Collins, any additional texture you want to offer on this point?
Just to add that at one of our work group meetings, we did have an entire meeting that covered the topic. Since the interim report came out on best practices for funding. So we did look at that, as also we had another meeting devoted on, like, there's a question here about the ELL weight. And so that is something that the work group has been exploring as well. And we'll probably be providing some type of recommendations when the final report is submitted.
Got it. So it sounds like the work group is kind of diving into this question of sufficiency, what's already covered in the law, what will need to go beyond the scope of the law, and digging into these excellent questions.
Can I ask a question, Fagan?
Absolutely.
In the educational for EL students, one of the things that I've had as a belief, and I think I've read something about this, that part of the educational makeup certainly includes the parents. And one of the things that we did in Montgomery County for a period of time is to provide support for English training in the evenings and weekends for parents. And many parents told us that helped their engagement in the educational system for their kids in school, as well as other benefits therein. So if we believe that the parents are an essential component of the children's educational learning, and that, with a relatively small amount of monies to invest in just helping that process, that part of that learning component may also include what can we do in these areas that will assist the parents, that also assist the learning process for the teachers as well. And I'm not sure whether or not we've ever looked at that, or any studies have been made on that, but it's a relatively small investment just to teach parents basic English that helps the students, that helps them engage with the parents and the teachers and everybody else in the school system. And I'm not sure whether we've ever looked at that, if there have been any studies that have done that, because what we're trying to do is improve the lot for the students. And to me, I think that may be a correlation there that we have not fully engaged in.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. Yeah, it's something we should really center to the extent we're doing 2-generation kind of investments and how that might show up. I don't know if anyone from Msde wants to weigh in on that, or Rachel, you have a point of view on that question.
I just wanted to add that that was one of the reasons that the commission proposed a higher weight and added funding for the family coordinators, was in part to identify what services such as English language training or job training or whatever that the family might need, and connecting them with the services, not necessarily paying for them, but connecting them to the services, and trying to identify if there are public resources to cover the cost of that. So that is very much part of what that additional funding is intended to be for.
Yeah, I think to bubble up Shamoya's comment here, that Chair Leggett's comments are well aligned with the potential in community schools as well. And Ebony's point that there are numerous studies on adult education and that we can engage that scholarship well.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just on that, the wraparound services, the funding that go to community, we're going to get to this, but the funding for community schools for wraparound services specifically includes actually covering the cost of services for parents and families around English and job training and other things like that.
And there may be intersections with the Judy and Patty centers, as Shamoya indicates as well. So I think it's a good lens to apply as we look at all of these investments.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to go back to a clarifying question Ebony raised. Rachel, this one's for you, about are there different funding formulas for students who are both English learners and who receive special education services? And if both formulas will follow the same student if they qualify for both, or is there some kind of offset?
That is an excellent question. And to the best of my recollection, I'm hesitating because we went back and forth on this. And so I'm actually trying to make sure I express the way we ended up. But essentially, if you are an English language student, you will get the English language funds. If you're a special ed student, you will get the special ed funds. We adjusted the weights so previously in the Thornton formulas, you only got one. The funds were adjusted so that if you counted in both, you weren't getting the full double funding essentially. And so we nixed that. And now if you're an EL student, you get the EL funding. If you're a special ed student, you get the special ed funding.
Got it. Thank you, Rachel. And thank you, Ebony, for that question. I'd like to invite Carolina Reyes to kind of give us a little more texture on her comment here, if she's on the line. Carolina Reyes.
Yes, hey, how are you? I am working, so you're gonna hear a big background. I'm in a childcare center, so if you hear children dancing and son is over here, okay?
All the better, I like it. Go ahead.
Well, thank you for the opportunity as an immigrant and director of a bilingual childcare center in the state. I ask this question because I have encountered, a lot of my families who are immigrants that sometimes when the child goes to the public school system, they had to be evaluated. And I noticed that not just the Latino community, but in general, a lot of immigrants, when they go there, they are assessed, the kindergarten assessments is in English. And when we look at the data, sometimes we say children are not ready to enter kindergarten. However, we need to consider that we live in a very diverse, state. And many times I think it will be very helpful to be able to bring, those people who already maybe are immigrant as well, who are have higher education that can assist with the assessment part. So that way we can probably consider targeting, not just focusing on all the children's learning English only. We are very diverse, or some of them know a lot of the things, but once they enter the public school system, they are put in ELL classes. A lot of the people in the community have a misconception, and they are afraid that the child will put behind because we're in this part of the program. So I'm just saying that it will be great to invest, to have more diverse, teachers in the public school system. And I was just writing also the comment that somebody say about providing classes for the parents. I agree. I think this is a great idea. I live in Seattle when I immigrated to the United States, and I had the opportunity there to be able to go to the community college to take free classes. And that was a way for me to be part of the community, to be inserted in the new country that I'm coming. And I was able to learn language. So I'm able to now to speak out for myself. And I think that's what we need to do. We need to empower our families and our immigrant community. That's it. That's some of the ideas that I think they could be put in there. I thought at the beginning, they didn't have, much on what to invest. So I think those two could be a great ideas.
Carolina, thank you so much. And thank you for everything you're doing in our community and for sharing your story. I think these questions and comments are exactly what we're looking for today, particularly as this work group dials in, and we'll make sure that we capture this and keep this front and center as we move forward. I know we want to save time for 4.5. And so, Rachel, I'm wondering if we should try to get through 4.3, or do we want to jump to 4.5?
No, let's go ahead and do 4.3 because it's also related to English learners and special education. Yeah.
All right, let's jump into 4.3.
Okay. So 4.3 is the weights or the per pupil funding for special education students and English learners. And so for special education, funding was actually provided in what we call the Bridge to Kerwin legislation. So the LEAs have had about $65 million in extra special education funds since fiscal 20, which is why there's a back arrow there in fiscal 22. And the new funding formula that incorporates that additional money and then a higher amount of money takes effect for this current fiscal year 23. So the funding is in the budget this year, and it increases, it phases up to its full amount. And it's expressed as a weight. So the weight is 146% of the per pupil foundation amount. That's just one way to think about it, or the way that it's typically, so it's the foundation amount times, in this case, you would receive 1.46 of the foundation amount for every special education student. And those monies have to be used to provide services that are required by a student's individualized education program or their 504 plan. And the State Board of Education is in the blueprint, will monitor how the special education funding is being used and the supports provided to them with the funding. And of course, it will also be part of the AIB's broader, review of use of funds and effectiveness of funds. So in last week in Pillar 5, we talked about the minimum school funding requirement for the blueprint formulas, and that the minimum is 75%. There are some exceptions to that. One of those exceptions is special education funding, where 100% of the per pupil funding must follow the students down to the school level. There are a few caveats there, but essentially it's 100% needs to be going towards services supporting those students. And that's a new requirement. And then 4.3.2 is the English learners weight, and that's 85%. So for every additional EL student in a school, the school receives another 0.85 of the foundation amount for the services for that student. And that also begins this fiscal year.
Got it. Great. Thank you so much. Let's open up here to questions. Let's see. All right, I'll start. Buzzy, I'm gonna come back to you and then I'm gonna get into Scott's question here. So Buzzy, will 431B, will AIB look into the fact that some LEAs are using Blueprint special ed funds to supplant, not supplement, local funds for special ed? So getting into kind of local share of funding and the question of supplanting versus supplementing. Rachel, you want to start, and then maybe we can invite our friends at Msde to weigh in.
Sure. I mean, essentially, the 100% spending requirement, minimum spending requirement, applies to both the state and the local funds that are part of the formula. So the entire amount has to follow students to the schools and be used for special education services.
Okay. Thank you, Rachel. Scott, I want to lift up your comment that there are often issues with there not being enough providers necessary to provide IEP-related health services. Pay tends not to be competitive with private or hospital work. It is also not always clear how many of these types of providers LEAs may need to meet need. It is also not clear how this money will track down to recruiting or retaining providers. Scott, I think this is an excellent point, and I know that this is a point that we're kind of mindful of across the entire law, because there's a number of kind of private providers that are going to be important to providing a great education for all of our kids, including the childcare system. So I know that this is something that's top of mind for us at the AIB, but also for the team at Msde in terms of how this all gets rolled out and designed and how RFPs for providers are crafted. So Ari, I don't know if you want to speak at a high level about that broad concern, because I know this is a complicated issue and something that you all are putting a lot of time into.
I am so sorry. I'm so sorry, but can you just repeat this sort of high level version? I was trying to get my answers to different questions. And
all good. Thank you for all you're doing in the chat. The question gets at the shortage of kind of private providers, whether it's in the healthcare space, whether it's in childcare space. And obviously we're bringing Judy centers and Patty centers online. If you could just speak a little bit broadly how Msde thinks about how we engage private providers in the solution that the Blueprint's trying to deliver for our kids.
Gosh, this is this is the question. This is a very great question. I'm not going to sit here and pretend like we have the answer. I think if we did, we could, I don't know, we could all be really rich. Not that that would be our goal, but just because it is a very challenging question, both in IEP related providers, but also, as you all know, I mean, health providers across the country are struggling, but also educational, right? Like we're hearing teachers, at least in some subject areas and in some places on the teacher side as well. So we are thinking about trying to pull, support every lever we can across these areas, whether that's grants, whether that's loan forgiveness, whether that's like we're thinking about all of the things, but I wish I had a magic bullet sort of solution here, but this is what we're going to be looking to. I wish I had a better answer other than to say, like, we're going to be continuing to work with our locals to think about what we can do in terms of are there creative ways to cut any sort of regulatory requirements that are not necessary, but a lot of the regulatory requirements are necessary for safety, for kids' safety, for to meet federal requirements. So we are always open and all ears. If anyone has ideas that we should be considering that is within our power, we would love to hear them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Joe, I know your pillar 2 deals with kind of enlisting talent in the delivery of outstanding education. Because I think, Scott, your second point, your follow-up point is right. It's not just private, but also the school employed providers. And to Ari's point, this is kind of a human capital issue writ large and a provider issue writ large, not just in this category, but across the entirety of implementation. Joe, can you speak a little bit to how kind of your team is starting to think about this through the prism of Pillar 2 and conversations that might be happening there?
I mean, I think we, during the last session, we elevated some of the work that Msde is doing around the kind of grow your own models. And I think, it does give me pause because we had talked about that really from the kind of frame of growing your own teachers, or, trying to find ways to bring paraprofessionals into the profession. But, I think Scott's comment is spot on, especially as you talk about related service providers, especially in, I remember going on a visit to the Eastern Shore and just hearing from them struggles with finding psychologists that wanted to work in schools, physical therapists, occupational therapists. So really some of the related service providers figuring out what processes we can put in place in order to motivate more folks to enter the field within related services as well, to try to continue to shore up our across the state.
Thank you, Joe. Scott, suffice to say, this issue of human capital across all the necessary service provision is something that we're thinking really hard about, and we're going to keep it front and center. And I appreciate you raising this and bringing accountability to this piece, because we can resource all the right things in theory, but if we can't get great people to do this work, we're going to come up very, very short. And I think COVID has just made it even harder to get fantastic people in all of these seats. So we're going to keep working on this. And I know that we're talking actively with Msde of how we can work in partnership to address it. I think ultimately it's going to take a pretty comprehensive, all hands on deck effort from everyone. Not just AIB, not just Msde, but from everyone, to make sure that we're recruiting great educators, great teachers, great healthcare providers, childcare providers. Like, we need to make sure we're bringing everybody into this, because the shortage is very real. I want to go back. Go ahead.
Can I just add, hopefully the additional funds provided through the special education formula do help at least to address making pay more competitive.
Yeah, make it more attractive.
Yeah, that doesn't, obviously, that we still have the pipeline issue, and particularly in special education, that is a area of teacher shortage pretty much every year. This also sort of is a connection to the consortium. Scott referenced health services. The consortium is very focused on behavioral health services as opposed to physical health services. But when we get to that in a minute, I think it's a good connection to that, because the whole design of the consortium is to try to leverage the availability of private providers in the community to meet the needs of students.
Yep. I want to go back now to a question that Shamoya raised. And I think this is such a good question, which is, how will the AIB support accessible transparency, re the flow of blueprint funds? Highlighting that tracking dollars is key, and something that families and educators across the state expect. Rachel, I'll kick that to you first.
Well, it's an excellent question, and transparency, as we keep talking about, is going to be key to the AIB's work. The school systems are going to be required to report to the AIB on their via Msde, I believe, on the flow of their funds, and we are going to be following that. We're going to be tying that back to their implementation plans and how they're also using the funds. And so that will absolutely be a key part of the transparency. What that looks like, I don't know yet. We'll think about that, but we want to make it as transparent as possible for families and the public and everyone for accountability.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. I want to flag.
Rachel, would it be, or I'm sorry, Fagan, would it
Go
be
ahead.
helpful to hear just 2 seconds of an update on the financial transparency data systems in answering that question that I know we're just getting off the ground from Justin?
Sure. Yeah, this is the new system that the blueprint called for, so that the data could actually be collected and tracked at the state level. So yeah, that's a great idea. Thank you, Ari.
Sure. Well, then happy to. We are certainly excited about this project and this collaboration with AIB as we begin to roll this out, in part because, as Rachel mentioned, part of being able to do this really important tracking work is having an actual system that allows us to do the tracking work in the first place. And so we have recently at the July 6th Board of Public Works meeting, we had our contract approved for a vendor to engage in this work. It is Power School. And that vendor was selected for a number of reasons. But one of the advantages, in part, associated with that vendor is that they have both enterprise resource planning, which are the financial systems, as well as student information or SIS systems. That allows us to meet some of the unique needs of the programs associated with the blueprint, particularly in our ability to administer and report to AIB and, of course, publicly related to education articles, titles 5234 and 5406, which are the specific pieces of the law. 5234 is the piece that requires essentially for the major aid categories for local education agencies to ensure that they're allocating or budgeting, at least for most of the categories, it's 75% of those per pupil funds at those schools where those students are going to be enrolled. For a couple programs, it's 100%. And then 5406 is the other side of the equation. And that's one of the things that's kind of really cool about this in general. So it's, hey, are you allocating and budgeting funds where they're supposed to go for the students who those funds are supposed to go to and on the programs and services that are intended? And then 5406 comes back and says, okay, but now not only did you budget that there, did you spend it there? And so we will be collaborating with the AIB throughout this implementation as we roll this out. The system is designed, part of the goal of this is to have it interoperable with all local education agency, ERP, and SIS systems that make the data cleaner. It also helps us with our state aid calculations. So, speaking of Pillar 4 and resources, also that piece. And it really also is the mechanism by which we can do so much more on reporting and public transparency, and of course meet our obligations to AIB with those regards as well.
Justin, thank you so much. And Charlemar, your comment is spot on about the importance of relationship and the partnership between AIB and Msde, and Justin's portfolio is just one of many examples of where we have to work hand in glove to make all of this work. Thank you for taking time to walk through that, Justin. Mr. Manko, you have something you want to jump in on here?
I wanted to resurface a comment that Cleo Hirsch put in the chat that was a long time ago, so I didn't know if it was going to get buried. But the question is just about EL and special education weights for pre-kindergarten students, and if that's something that was included in the blueprint, or if that was not included. And what happens then for early learners that fall into one of these categories and need additional supports?
It's a great question. Rachel, you want to jump in?
Yeah, the commission did recommend that pre-K students who are English learners or have been identified as needing early intervention for needs should receive additional funds for those services.
Got it.
Hey,
And this-
Cleo, sorry. So it is a weight? Because I was under the impression it was not. So I just want to correct my own understanding. So there is an additional weight at the pre-Q level? Is that what that answer meant? Sorry.
No, that's a fair question. So the commission recommended that, and what I need to go back and double check is the degree to which it was reflected in this in the very technical formula funding language and whether it's incorporating pre-K enrollment in those counts. I don't recall, but I know that was the intent.
Okay, we'll get back to this one, everybody. Thank you for that question. Rachel, I think we should move on to 4.4 so that we can hopefully get through 4.5 with the time we have left.
Okay. So 4.4 meaning community schools?
Yep.
Okay. So, so the next big sort of bucket of funding and policy is around community schools, and specifically providing state funds for schools that have high concentrations of students living in poverty. This is a unique in the country, quite frankly, to be recognizing in addition to compensatory education funding, which is for every low-income student, also recognizing at the school level that concentrations of poverty lead to different levels of needs, and that we need to support those needs, and that they're all not all academic necessarily, that there are, that it's the, you know, sort of the whole child and whole family meeting the needs, because if you don't meet those needs, students aren't coming to school or aren't coming to school able to learn. And so this is an area the commission spent a lot of time on. And essentially, there's sort of three major tasks here. The first is and they're sort of in order, chronological order. So the first funding is provided to community schools for personnel grants, is what they're called. And this is funding for a community school coordinator and for full-time health coverage at that school. The health coverage has to be provided by, and you can see it in 4.1b, a licensed physician, physician's assistant, or registered nurse, but it does not have to be a single person. It is just that you have to have the full-time coverage. And you can see the back arrow in fiscal 22. This provision was part of the 2019 Kerwin legislation and began to fund the personnel grants for schools that were at the highest poverty level, which is 80% and above. So those schools have been receiving personnel grants since fiscal 20. And then the formula is phased in so that ultimately, so it started at 80% and up, and then in fiscal 21, it went to 75. In fiscal 22, it went to 70. Emma's putting a helpful chart on the screen for everyone because it's a little complicated. And so by fiscal 25, every school that has a concentration poverty of more than 55% or more will be receiving this personnel grant. And based on these estimates are pre-COVID, but it was about 550 schools around the state, and nearly every county will have concentration of poverty grants. And these grants, again, another unique thing about them is that they go directly to the schools. So in general, they're not, most funding formula, I mean, it's still going through the school system and the central office, but for all the other funding formulas, in general, the money, you know, we have our minimum funding requirement, which is also new, but otherwise it's the central office that's allocating those funds out to the schools. These concentration poverty grants, all of it is to go directly to the school, to be spent at the school level. There is, if you could go back, Emma, thank you. There is in 4.1a, though, a provision in the law that allows LEAs that have more than 40 eligible concentration of poverty grant schools to essentially pool half of that money and sort of leverage it at the central office level to across the eligible schools, and that the other 50% still has to go down to the school and be used at the school level as they based on their own requirements and decisions. Really is what it's about, putting the decision making at the school level. And so that provision has also been in place since fiscal 20. And what's the last one? Oh, 4.4.1C is just a provision that allows any money from these personnel grants that aren't needed for the actual personnel costs to be used to do the required needs assessment, which is in 4.4.2, and then also to start to provide wraparound services to meet the needs of students and their families in the school. 4.4.2 is the community school aspect of the program, which is every school that receives this grant, it essentially becomes a community school. They have a community school coordinator, and they're required to do a needs assessment in partnership with other local entities and agencies to identify, and also the school community, to identify the needs of the students and the families in that community. And you can see in 4.4.2b that includes physical, behavioral, and mental health needs, as well as other wraparound services. And that needs assessment has to be completed within a year of receiving the grant. And so the timeline is shown there as well. So as more schools come into the program, we'll be receiving more of these needs assessments will be done. Then the last piece is 4.4.3, which deals with the per pupil funding. So we've got the personnel grant, which is a set amount for each school. And then we've got per pupil funding, which is on a sliding scale, depending on the level of poverty in that school. And so the 80% and above schools receive the highest highest amount of per pupil funding. And as the poverty level is lower, the per pupil amount is lower on the sliding scale. And there's a phase-in schedule for the per pupil funding that essentially you get your personnel grant, and 2 years later you start to get your per pupil funds. So the idea is you get your personnel grant, you do your needs assessment, you identify how you are going to spend your per pupil funds, and then you start to receive your per pupil funds. That's sort of the logic there.
Rachel, thank you. And thank you everyone for your questions and engagement. I'm seeing some questions here for 4.4. I'm also seeing a fair amount of questions about health services. So Rachel, I think I'm gonna, if I may impose just a little bit more on you, if we could go ahead and do 4.5 as well.
Oh,
then
sure.
we'll do as many questions as we can with the time left. The questions we can't get to, we'll document, and we'll be sure to follow up with everybody after this. And just want to reassure Ellie, who's had a question on 4.4 since 1:20, that we're coming right back to that as soon as we get through this. All right,
Sure.
Rachel, let's do it.
I'll be there. I'll try to do this quickly. So 4.5 is all around enhancing student health and behavioral health services. And so 4.5.1 is really, it's a provision that has been in the law for a couple of years now, that required every LEA to hire a behavioral health coordinator, which did not exist prior to 2018. And this was a requirement that was part of the 2018 Safe to Learn Act. And so part of the blueprint was actually providing funding for those behavioral health coordinators, which was not funded in the 2018 law. And then also there, you can see Msde and the Department of Health have roles to play in the training of employees and having their own coordinators for behavioral health services. 4.5.2 deals with the school systems and their plans for enhancing and expanding behavioral health supports. And specifically, this deals with the A, B, and C really relate to the COVID relief funding that was provided for LEAs to support students with behavioral health. You know, as we all know, the needs just grew astronomically during the pandemic and continue. And so that really relates to the pandemic impact. And then D relates to the ongoing requirement for LEAs to be reporting on how they are providing their students, how they're identifying them and how they're providing health services as part of their blueprint plans. And that really ties in with the consortium. But before we get there, very quickly, in 4.5.3, this deals with training on recognizing behavioral health needs in students. This is a new annual training requirement that began in fiscal 22. And the LEAs started doing it last year. And you can see that anyone in the school building that has direct contact with students is required to be trained in how to recognize behavioral health issues, and also students who are experiencing trauma or have experienced violence. And then the final provision I will just very broadly describe. This is the Consortium on Coordinated Community Supports. It's a bit of a mouthful. And this is a brand new entity that the blueprint that was established as part of the blueprint to really try to leverage community providers and the greater, public-private partnership kind of concept for addressing behavioral health needs of students in their communities. There's a huge shortage of the space providers and treatment services. And so there are a number of different things that the consortium is required to do related to developing community support partnerships and models for how local school systems can work with these partnerships to treat every student that needs services. The consortium will ultimately receive $130 million a year. It ramps up to do all of these things and to literally fund services. And then there are also accountability provisions. The consortium lives in the Maryland Department of Health under the Community Health Resources Commission. I hope I said that right. And they will be staffing the consortium along with some other folks. And they are not, the consortium is not similar to the CTE committee. It's not fully appointed yet. It's not up and running. They're in the early phases of planning and starting to get off the ground. We do have someone from the executive director of that commission available to provide an update if you'd like. And then the very last item here, 4.5.5, is expanding school-based health centers. And this was also a big piece of the blueprint. And beginning in fiscal 23, the funding is in the budget. The school-based health centers are essentially fully funded as they were initially, the grand plan for school-based health centers. The funding is provided in the budget to fully fund what that plan was for school-based health centers and to expand them. And I'll just note that responsibility for the primary responsibility for school-based health centers in legislation just this past session was shifted to the Department of Health, but Msde still plays a role in that as well.
Great. Rachel, thank you so much for going through all of that. I'm going to just bubble up a few comments that have been coming through in the chat from Shamoya. We'll be evaluating later, but we hope the AIB will prioritize an analysis of the amount of funding making its way to each school under the concentration of poverty program at each qualifying level. MLDS has highlighted the impacts of familial poverty on student achievement even reverses Black-white achievement in some instances. Initial analysis we've seen of the concentration of poverty grant programs translations to dollar amounts over time has revealed some concerns that high, but not the highest poverty schools may still be shortchanged. We set artificial parameters around concentration of student poverty, but the impacts on students won't always track neatly with thoughtful equity-focused phase and plan. I'll bubble up some comments here from Scott on 455 around the increase and expand school-based health centers. MDH is currently working on a SBHC needs assessment. It may make sense for AIB to discuss with MDH what they think what should be expected out of the needs assessment. It would also be helpful for AIB to flesh out what they think should be happening with SBHC expansion. There's a little guidance on that. The money that is set aside for SBHC isn't really going very far. AIB should consider thinking through what the end goal is for SBHC and pushing the state towards those funding goals. Scott, those are great points. I want to go back to a question that Ellie raised about 35 minutes ago. Let me find it here. I promised I'd get to it here. Let's see. Can the AIB examine how coordination is defined? This is going back to 4.4. Also examine the 40 school threshold. School districts with fewer than 40 schools need some flexibility to support administration of concentration of poverty grants and supporting quality of community school implementation. Rachel, how is coordination defined, the AIB?
That's a great question, and one that I guess we'll be defining.
Ellie, thanks for flagging this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Rachel, should we keep pushing on questions or do I need to kind of yield back?
Let's see. I think I just want to flag for you, was there a question even earlier that you had wanted to circle back to? I just didn't want you to.
Let's see.
You mentioned that, but I've been busy talking, so I haven't been able to monitor the chat as much. So I just want to make sure there wasn't an early one that you wanted to.
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we're good. Yep.
Okay. So we have about we have about 10 minutes left. Maybe we could ask Mark Luckner to just give a brief update on the consortium, and maybe there are some questions in the chat that he might be able to address where the consortium is related, and then we could try to come back and handle a few more questions.
That sounds terrific.
Rachel, it's very, very nice to see you. Really, really nice to see you again, and thanks for the invitation. So as Rachel said, my name is Mark Luckner, state employee, executive director of the Maryland Community Health Resource Commission. Happy to answer any questions. Just for background, the Community Health Resource Commission is a state agency that is part of the Maryland Department of Health, as Rachel said. I've been here since 2009, when the legislature added the provision creating the consortium a couple of years ago. We were humbled and flattered to take on this responsibility. And as Rachel said, we're in the beginning phases of the planning. The legislature approved the bill Senate Bill 802 last session, which we appreciate, that made a couple of adjustments to the consortium provisions, and I'm happy to talk about them. But essentially, there are 24 members serving on the consortium, and we're grateful to have 4 full-time positions that we'll be recruiting for, including a full-time, what we call consortium project director, and then also 2 administrative program managers, and then a budgetary person. We are thrilled that the legislature will be appointing the chair of the consortium, and I won't scoop that person. Maybe Rachel, next time when this body meets, we could have that chair come in. But I'm thrilled with the legislature's selection. We anticipate having the first meeting of the consortium. All of our meetings will be public. That's what we do at our agency, as most public agencies do. We'll have meetings this summer and then fall. And for folks that are familiar with the work of the commission, we're also implementing this Maryland Health Equity Resource Act. And it started about a year ago. And we had a kickoff meeting last summer and then had substantive subcommittee work throughout the fall, where we engage the public on key implementation questions. And we found that that was very helpful in issuing the first call for proposals and also engaging the public and key stakeholders. And so with the consortium that will be launched this late summer and fall, following leadership of the consortium, we plan on having a similar subcommittee process, engaging the public, and we plan to meet the requirement that we submit that first legislative report December 2022, so in a few months. And the types of subcommittees we're thinking about are an RFP and framework subcommittee. Another subcommittee we're thinking about, and again, this will come from the direction of the consortium on the staff, program accountability and data. We want to make sure that at the beginning of the process, we're working very closely with Rachel and the AIB and the longitudinal data system, including I would also thank the legislature for adding the National Center for School Mental Health to provide assistance. But we want to make sure we're able to demonstrate progress, impact, and accountability for these community support partnerships, which Rachel said earlier are funded at $50 million in year one, which began a few days ago, July 1st, 2023, and ramps up, as Rachel said, all the way to 125, 130 million in the out years. So we're very excited for this work, and we're very excited to get to know. We know the folks on the health side of the house pretty well, but we're very excited to get to know colleagues on the education side of the house as well. So thank you for this opportunity, and we're looking forward to getting to know everyone on this board more closely in the coming weeks, months, and years. Thank you again, Rachel, for the invitation.
Thank you, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. Wanted to bubble up Ellie's comment about wanting to flag support for community school system support at state level. Right now, just a single person for a large role might have some connection to the consortium as well. If there's any other questions for Mark on the consortium work, now would be the time to bubble them up.
I think there's a question there in the chat from
Shamoya.
Yeah.
Is the consortium waiting for any appointments?
Would you like me to answer that, Rachel?
Please.
Yes,
Sure.
please.
Sure. So there's 24 members. Thank you for that, Shamoya. It's good to see you again. So there's a total of 24 appointments to be made, and I think the legislature, which has a total of 6 appointments to make, is in the process of finalizing those. So if anybody on this call would like to help get out the word about those remaining appointments, I'd be happy to speak with people directly. And those appointments are largely to be made by the presiding officer. So you're welcome to give names directly onto Speaker Jones and President Ferguson's office for their consideration. But there's a total of 6 appointments to be made, 2 members of the public, a member of the House of Delegates, a member of the State Senate, and then an expert in equity in education, and an expert in excellence in education. So, like I said, we know the health side of the house pretty well, but the education side we're getting to know more. So, Shamoya, if you'd like to, help recruitment, and anybody on this call would like to help, have a diverse array of candidates to serve on this consortium.
Mark, when you think about the education side of the equation, what are the kind of big question marks for you, kind of where you sit right now and kind of where we are in the process? Like, what's top of mind?
Thanks for asking. So I would say, so we staff this Council on Advancement of School-Based Health Centers. Okay, the Council on Advancement of School-Based Health Centers, and one of the things, which is comprised of 15 members appointed by the governor, several ex officio state agencies, and we've worked pretty closely with the health department, and we're following that bill that Rachel talked about earlier that shifted responsibility there, and then our brothers and sisters at Msde. And as I get to try to understand the day-to-day work that Msde is implementing, plus I'm also a parent, in the health side of the house, they talk a lot about HIPAA, right? and how you can't have information that's protected health information or PHI shared and all that. And so when we work with our grantees who are community-based providers like federal qualified health centers or local health departments or school-based health centers, we're always wanting to demonstrate outcome data. And so you have to sort of have a certain process and policies and procedures such as data use agreements and all of that to demonstrate impact on the health side of the house. On the education side of the house, which I'm less familiar with, I know that there's FERPA, right? And people know a lot more about that than me, and I'll bone up on it. So similarly, I'm sure that there are challenges on the education side of the house to collect data, not at the individual student level, of course, right. Of course, but to collect data to demonstrate, a baseline of where we are on some of the key factors that this consortium is charged with improving, and then demonstrate that there's progress towards overall goals and objectives. So I think one of the things I'm going to want to work a lot closely with my colleagues from Msde is, what really does FERPA mean, and what are the responsible approaches to collecting and gathering data, while also, without running afoul of what those requirements are. So that's something that I'm thinking a lot about. Thank you for asking the question.
Yeah, that's important. And it, harmonizes with a lot of, I think, what we're thinking about across the board today, which is, what's the right way to count kids? What's the right way to reach kids, while also obviously respecting people's privacy and some of these protocols we have in place. So thanks for going into that. Any final questions for Mark, for the AIB, for Msde? These have really been some fantastic comments, and just so much good stuff has bubbled up in the chat. And I know we're capturing it as we go.
Yeah.
I think the theme around transparency and reporting and understanding where dollars flow and how they flow and the extent to which they're filling gaps, so key. Obviously a huge human capital and provider theme of making sure that we've got folks who are both school-based and in the private market filling all the various roles that we need to fill here across the board. A huge opportunity with the consortium, and I hope people really heard Mark's kind of call for interest in that. That's a massively important part of the puzzle. And then obviously this recurring question that I think the chair did an excellent job and Rachel did an excellent job of kind of parsing through that around just sufficiency of funds in the context of the blueprint, and something that we're going to be assessing in real time as we go. So, and then of course, Carolina's comments and feedback today around early intervention with our kids and supporting English language learners, meeting them where they are, them and their families, supporting the adults in their lives. I really appreciated all of that, and I heard that. So thank you all so much for the time and input and the feedback today. Rachel, I'll turn it back to you.
Let me interrupt. First of all, thank you, Fagan, for your leadership today, and thank all of those who participated. We have a couple of outlines for our summer sessions. So Rachel, why don't you give us the dates and times for the future meetings to continue our summer work sessions?
Absolutely. So next week we will have Pillar 1. And that meeting will be after the AIB meeting. So the AIB has a board meeting at 1 p.m. And then following that, so around 3:30, depending on how long the board meeting goes, it might start a little later, will be the first working session on Pillar 1. And then we will have covered them all once. And then we're going to start coming back around. And so the following week on August 4th, will be the follow-up to, we need to circle back and finish Pillar 2 and also Pillar 5. And then the following week of August 11th, we will, and you can see this on your screen there as the third bullet, we will focus on Pillar 3 and Pillar 4.
Okay.
And we'll put a whole schedule out so that
continue to submit questions or comments as we go forward back to you and the staff, correct?
Right. And so there is a link on the slide. There's also, I think Graham will drop another link in the chat so that you can easily, if you have questions or comments that you didn't make today in the chat, please feel free to submit those and we will incorporate them. into the future documentation. Absolutely.
Are there any further questions or comments you want to make, Rachel, before we depart?
No, I think everyone's tired of hearing me talk.
All right, again, let me thank Mara and Fagan for their leadership today, all of those who've asked questions. I hope that you will tune in for our next session, which is on the 28th. If that's it, we are adjourned for today. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.